In 1888, in London's Whitechapel district, the inhabitants reeled from the recent series of murders attributed to an assailant referred throughout history as Jack the Ripper. Many suspects came to the forefront as it seemed, and as time went on, the list grew substantially. Originally, there were 5 murders in Whitechapel that historians and criminologists have referred to as the canonical 5. But since the murders occurred, there have been other murders before the originals and after the last canonical that have been attributed to this most elusive killer. Over time, there have been several theories that, frankly, seem more ludicrous and fabricated to fit the evidence rather than pointing to a viable suspect. Of the many that have made sense, one in particular drew close attention from those who have studied the case very closely. This suspect in the world's most famous serial killings gained notoriety after a letter was discovered at an auction in 1993. Stuart Evans, a now retired British policeman, acquired a letter written by the former head of the special branch at Scotland Yard, one John G. Littlechild. In the letter composed by Littlechild, in September of 1913, a full 25 years after the murders, the inspector responded to a query put forth to him by a journalist named George R. Sims regarding suspects in the murders. Littlechild, although he was not directly involved with the case at the time but knew the investigators, named a suspect that had never really been researched before, a quack doctor named Tumblety from America. Littlechild wrote,
I never heard of a Dr. D in connection with the Whitechapel murders, but amongst the suspects, and to my mind a very likely one, was a Dr. T, which sounds very much like D. He was an American quack named Tumblety and was at one time a frequent visitor to London, and on these occasions brought under the notice of police, there being a larger dossier concerning him at Scotland Yard. Although a psychopath as sexual a subject, he was not known as a sadist, which the murderer unquestionably was. But his feelings towards women were remarkable and bitter in the extreme, a fact on record.
Born in Ireland in 1833, Francis Tumblety's family moved to the United States sometime around 1847 and settled in Rochester, New York. This journey took place during the Irish potato famine, where many Irish families moved away from the starvation occurring in their homeland. Nothing much is known of Tumblety's childhood, but as a teenager he began working as a steward for a doctor who proclaimed himself an expert on French cures of sexual diseases. Tumblety also tried to sell rudimentary pornography to all the boatmen that would frequent the pubs around the Erie Canal. One of these boatmen described the young man as a dirty, awkward, ignorant, uncared-for, good-for-nothing boy, utterly devoid of education. Tumblety then went to work at Dr. Lispinard's hospital in Rochester, where he specialized in treating ailments that were particular to women. He performed hysterectomies and treated the problems of youth, mainly venereal diseases. Soon after Tumblety gained a little notoriety with his dirty wares, a man named Rudolph Lyons set up a temporary office in Rochester where he sold patent medicines that seemed to cure, according to Lyons, everything from pimples to cancer. Tumblety adopted this form of trade and later started his own business with the same plan in Detroit, Michigan in 1855. Tumblety knew he needed a gimmick and called himself a full-fledged Indian herb doctor. He also continued to sell the French cures for the sexual diseases as well. Tumblety knew he had to give his business some credibility and stated that he earned a medical degree from a medical school, a claim that proved untrue. Although a blatant lie, Tumblety began signing his name with an MD at the end. He traveled extensively, and in 1857 he landed in Toronto, where he had been arrested by a Detective Simard for attempting to perform an abortion on a 17-year-old prostitute, Philomene Dumas. His lawyers maintained that the prostitute manufactured the case against him and authorities released him, although they knew his reputation as an illegal abortionist. Whenever Tumblety made his way to a new town, he would enter as if he were the featured member of a circus. His entourage included a valet and 2 dogs which followed closely behind him. This lifestyle seemed to suit Tumblety, but the haphazard way with which he used to conduct his businesses ran afoul of the law on more than one occasion. He later opened an office in New York and later worked in Jersey City, Pittsburgh, and then many western cities such as San Francisco. As is true with most charlatans, Tumblety was always on the move, where he traveled from Detroit through Toronto and eventually made his way to St. John, Brunswick in 1860. There, a patient in his care, one named Portmore, died. An inquest discovered that Tumblety had been guilty of manslaughter. After his release, authorities never saw the wily Tumblety again as he fled on one stormy night. From St. John, Tumblety arrived in Boston, Massachusetts, where his extravagant lifestyle made sure that his name appeared in the newspapers every day, as his advertisements would attract those seriously seeking medical assistance with whatever ailment may have plagued them at the time. The doctor was very flamboyant with his appearance and was not shy with exhibiting his proclivities to the male of the species. Obviously, what he peddled seemed to work because Tumblety registered incomes in the hundreds of thousands of dollars over successive years. At the start of the American Civil War, Tumblety settled in Washington, D.C., where he obtained a military uniform and claimed to be a member of General George B. McClellan's staff, the commander of the Union Army at the time. Tumblety became acquainted with several of the general's staff, and one man in particular, Colonel C.A. Dunham, had been interviewed sometime later when he became a successful lawyer based in New York City. Colonel Dunham stated that he attended a party on one occasion at Tumblety's apartments in Washington. Dunham thought it odd that no females appeared at the gathering. When Dunham queried his host, Tumblety launched into a homily against womankind, especially fallen women. In fact, as reported in the San Francisco Examiner, that he had all the instincts of a certain brutal and degraded class of debauchees, and hated them with a hatred that he never lost the opportunity of showing. Dunham then told of Tumblety's specimen collection that he seemed very proud to display to his guests. In one of the side rooms from where the party had been conducted, Dunham noticed approximately a dozen jars that Tumblety claimed contained the wombs of every class of women. Tumblety then related a story about his love for an older woman. She flirted heavily with him and kissed him and called him a dear jealous fool. Tumblety later discovered the woman to be a prostitute and that she saw other men. Dunham stated that Tumblety then gave up on all womankind. Some historians surmised that because of being jilted and the Montreal abortion case, this provided Tumblety with a case for the hatred for women. Not to be outdone internationally with his quackery, Tumblety made his way to England in July of 1888, 1 month before the start of the Ripper murders. The doctor knew London very well and traveling to England and staying for months at a time. By 1888, Tumblety's flamboyance tamed somewhat, and he began dressing more somberly and wore a dark ulster coat and a derby hat. By this time, Tumblety was 55 years old. On August 31, 1888, police found the body of Mary Ann Nichols. On the 8th of September, the body of Annie Chapman, with her corpse mutilated and her womb missing. And on September 30th, the bodies of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, the famous double event. Eddowes had her womb and her left kidney missing. Newspapers ran stories that there were strong rumors that the Ripper was an American doctor who fled in early October from his lodgings in the vicinity of the murders after his landlady found blood on one of his shirts. The authorities then surveyed the lodgings and at the port of Liverpool in the belief that the killer might try to sail to America. On November 7, 1888, police arrested Tumblety for gross indecency with another man. Unfortunately, this was a misdemeanor and the police could not hold him for more than 24 hours. Mary Jane Kelly was murdered in the early morning hours of November 9, 1888. The police then issued a warrant on November 14th for Tumblety's arrest, charging him with 4 counts of gross indecency with 4 different men: Albert Fisher, Arthur Bryce, James Crowley, and John Doughty. He appeared in the magistrate court of Marlborough Street on November 16th. Despite the suspicions of authorities, they had no evidence that would have connected Tumblety with the Whitechapel murders. The assistant commissioner in charge of detectives at Scotland Yard communicated with the chief of police in San Francisco to obtain Tumblety's handwriting samples. Subsequent to the issuance of the warrant on the charges of gross indecency, Tumblety fled to Boulogne, then Le Havre, then traveled to New York on the steamer Le Bretagne, where he allegedly landed on December 2nd, as reported in U.S. newspapers. Newspapers in New York carried the story of Tumblety's escape and described how Scotland Yard suspected the quack of being Jack the Ripper. In fact, news of those suspicions reached the United States, and appeared the accusations and suspicions followed Tumblety with a vengeance. Some of them reported that Tumblety had been arrested on suspicion of being the Whitechapel murderer until later corrections appeared as to the true charges. As much as the press and the police tried to candy coat it, Tumblety was a homosexual, or at the very least, bisexual. There are stories that in every city he visited, he sought out the company of young men. Since he hated women, as per the newspaper articles, arrest reports from London, and the stories that have been passed down through the decades, it is highly doubtful that Tumblety would have murdered women so savagely as has been reported. However, there are exceptions to the rules. The victims exhibited no real signs of sexual activity. Despite the suspicions that followed Tumblety, he died of a heart attack in St. John's Hospital in St. Louis, Missouri on May 28, 1903. Among his personal possessions when he died were $432.70 in cash, a $1,000 railway bond, a 17-diamond cluster ring valued at $75, a 5-diamond ring valued at $60, a $10 gold watch, and something more valuable to ripperologists, 2 imitation rings worth $3. Why is this important? One of the Ripper victims, Annie Chapman, had missing from her person 2 cheap brass rings that she wore constantly. Does this prove that perhaps Tumblety was Jack the Ripper? Well, these rings could have been purchased anywhere at the time for a very inexpensive price. Could they have been the missing Chapman rings? Certainly, but there is very little corroborating evidence that they actually did belong to the Ripper victim. What historians, criminologists, ripperologists, and amateur sleuths are left with is the history of circumstance that could or could not point the incriminating finger toward Francis Tumblety as being the most sought-after serial killer in human history. Although there is no exculpatory evidence to bring Tumblety to an historical verdict as being Jack the Ripper, the mystery continues. The British Empire saw a prosperity never experienced by other nations in the late 19th century. Colonies held by the monarchy produced more goods that could be consumed. But in understanding the time period, the opulence that defined the Victorian era was not shared by everyone living in the United Kingdom. Immigrants from every part of Europe trying to escape ethnic pogroms and poverty sought a better life in the heart of the empire. With this influx of humanity from all over Europa, persons seeking to exert their political beliefs also made the journey in the hopes of converting those to their manifesto. Socialism seemed to take hold in Europe, and the inroads to Britain had been softened in the hope that this political dogma would rock the British people, their traditions, and their stability. At all costs, though, the British crown would be preserved. In the 1880s, the class distinctions in Victorian England readily appeared to anyone who studied the era. An explosion of economic growth for the empire spelled poverty and hopelessness for some. The people who migrated to England learned very quickly that the land of prosperous opportunity, portrayed through propaganda and word of mouth, quickly disintegrated. Whole families that made their way to the East End of London quickly became acclimated to the economic conditions experienced by the poor and downtrodden. If women lost their husbands, they soon resorted to prostitution to support themselves and their families. Additionally, alcoholism ran rampant amongst the lower classes in the East End, and prostitutes used most of their money to support this addiction. The period portrayed throughout the years painted a grim picture of existence at this time, and those who wanted to topple governments, especially those who ascribed to socialism, saw the oppressed and demoralized perfect for conversion to the more repressive form of government. The ammunition to perfect this chaos came in the late 1880s and appeared as a specter in the night, and a perfect opportunity for anarchists to bring down the 1,000-year-old throne presented itself, and those who advocated socialism used the timely circumstances to their advantage. The possibility of a downright revolt and the demise of the royal family that most British people revered weighed heavily on the mind of the crown. On the night of August 31st, 1888, Mary Ann Polly Nichols combed the streets of Whitechapel in search of a client in order to get some money for a doss house, a flea-bag hotel. After leaving her husband and her children because of her drinking, she settled in the Whitechapel area. Before setting about to find a client, Polly spoke with her friend, Emily Holland, at approximately 1 a.m. and stated she was off to find some money so she could find a place to sleep for the night. Before turning to leave her friend, Polly stated, "Look what a lovely bonnet I've got." Polly then headed into Whitechapel, never to be seen alive again. At approximately 3:40 a.m. on Bucks Row, now present-day Durwood Street in London, police constables found Polly's body lying on her back. Later, when the body was stripped in the morgue, attendants noticed that Polly's abdomen had been ripped open by a jagged deep cut, and her throat had been sliced with 2 long cuts across her neck. Several other incisions had been made throughout the abdominal area with what appeared to be the same knife. Polly also suffered from genital mutilations. At 6:10 a.m. on the morning of September 8, 1888, Inspector Joseph Chandler, on duty at the Commercial Street Police Station, had been informed there had been another Whitechapel murder. When police arrived at the scene in the backyard of a house located on Hanbury Street, they found 45-year-old Annie Chapman. Chapman laid against a fence in the yard with her head almost touching the steps of the house. At her feet were laid 2 brass rings and 2 brass coins laid end to end. Her body exhibited signs of a butchered animal. Annie's entrails had been taken out and lain over her right shoulder. Her throat had been cut so deeply that her head was almost severed from her body. In the early morning hours of September 30th, 1888, Louis Deemschutz, a foreigner who ran a socialist club in Berner Street in Whitechapel, turned his horse and wagon into the backyard of the house where he lived with his wife. As he pulled further into the yard from the street, Deemschutz's horse reared, and the tired man noticed a bundle laying on the side of the yard. Deemschutz settled the horse and then poked at it with his whip. Deemschutz climbed down from the wagon and approached the bundle. He knelt down and lit a match. Deemschutz discovered a woman with her throat cut. He went into the club and gathered assistance from the members there. Neighbors and friends later identified the woman as Elizabeth Longliz Stride, the 3rd victim of the Whitechapel murderer. Later examination determined that Stride only had her throat cut, but she was dead nevertheless. An hour later, in Mitre Square, just 15 minutes away from the first woman's corpse, laid a second woman. Her feet pointed into the direction of Mitre Square, and her skirt had been raised up and her abdomen had been mutilated. The victim was identified as Catherine Eddowes. Later testimony at the coroner's inquest on Stride and Eddowes' death determined that the latter had been in police custody because of her drunken state earlier that evening. At 1 a.m. on the morning of the murder, police released Eddowes and she walked out of the police station, and her body was discovered 45 minutes after that. In addition to the cuts to her throat, the coroner noted that Eddowes suffered extreme mutilations to her face, her nose had been cut off, and several of her organs were missing, including that of her kidney. Following the murders known as the double event, a police constable walked past the doorway leading to 19 Goulston Street in Whitechapel. Shining his bull lantern on the ground inside the doorway, he noticed a piece of bloody apron. Above the apron, the police constable noticed some writing on the wall which stated, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." Once the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir Charles Warren, raced to the crime scene, he immediately ordered one of the constables at the scene to erase the writing. Sir Charles stated that he ordered the erasure to prevent anti-Jewish riots. After the double event of the Stride and Eddowes murders, on October 16th, a small box with a letter attached to it was received by George Lusk, the head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, one of the groups organized to catch the killer. When Lusk opened up the box and pulled out the letter, he noticed there was half a woman's kidney, and the letter stated,
"From hell. Mr. Lusk, sir, I send you half the kidney I took from one woman, preserved it for you. T'other piece I fried and ate, it was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife that took it out if you only wait a while longer. Signed, catch me when you can, Mr. Lusk."
Later examination of the postmarked kidney demonstrated that it did belong to Catherine Eddowes to a medical certainty. In light of the double event, more police had been engaged to patrol the streets of Whitechapel, both in uniform and plain clothes. With the enhanced police presence, no murders of the type of the previous four were reported in the month of October. All seemed quiet until the night of November 9th, 1888. Mary Jane Kelly was 25 years old and lived in a small rented room located at 13 Miller's Court in Whitechapel, just off Dorset Street, where one of the previous victims, Annie Chapman, once lived. Mary Kelly was born in Ireland and made her way to Wales in an attempt to find work when she was a young girl. Some records indicate that she made her way to the posh London West End, where she worked in an upscale house of prostitution where she claims to have had fine clothes and gentlemanly callers. During this time, something went wrong with the life this once innocent Irish colleen experienced. In April of 1887, Mary Kelly met a man by the name of Joseph Barnett, and the two almost immediately decided to live together. They moved from various lodging houses until, in the summer of 1888, Kelly and Barnett would move to the room at Miller's Court. Miller's Court could only be entered through a narrow archway from Dorset Street. Once inside the court, doors opening to the different rented rooms faced outward. One night in early November, Mary Kelly and Barnett had a fight, and he stormed out of the room. Kelly found herself in a local pub where she drank with some men and even entertained 3 or 4 of them during the course of the night. She took several of the drunken men back to her room. Witnesses reported that even after Mary Kelly entered the room with the man who would be her last customer, she could be heard singing, "A violet I plucked from my mother's grave." For over half an hour, neighbors could still hear the young Irish girl crooning the old song. At about 2 a.m. on November 9th, Joseph Hutchinson, an unfortunate man who could not find work, saw Kelly walking the streets more sober than she was before. Kelly asked Hutchinson for some money, and when Hutchinson stated he had none, Kelly walked past him and down Dorset Street. Hutchinson watched her as she strode down the street to find another customer until another man of Jewish appearance, with a felt hat pulled over his eyes, approached Kelly and spoke very softly to her. Hutchinson noted that Kelly giggled, and Kelly escorted the man back to her lodgings at Miller's Court. The man that Kelly picked up had a large gold chain in his waistcoat and carried gloves and a small package in his hands. Hutchinson followed the two into Kelly's lodgings in the hopes that she would service him for free. Hutchinson waited for an hour, and his presence was confirmed by another witness who walked by and saw him waiting for Kelly to finish. At approximately 4 a.m., Kelly's neighbor, Elizabeth Prater, was awakened by her cat, Diddles, when she also heard a faint cry of, "Oh, murder." Since these cries of murder were commonplace in the East End, no one thought to investigate. The next morning, at approximately 10:45 a.m., the landlord sent his agent to collect rent from Kelly, who was 3 months behind. When the agent knocked on the door, there was no reply, so he went around to the window and peered through it. The agent shrieked to himself when he witnessed the carnage left from the night before. Mary Kelly had been butchered like an animal. When police finally arrived and entered the room, they noticed what had once been Mary Kelly lying on the bed. Her throat had been cut from left to right, straight through to the spinal column. The murderer cut her from the vagina to the breastbone. He took out her heart, cut off her breasts with circular incisions, and put one by her head and the other by her feet. The murderer cut off her stomach flesh in 3 flaps and put them on the bedside table. He sliced off her chin, her lips, her nose, her eyebrows, her eyelids, skinned her cheeks, and skinned her forehead, completely disfiguring her face. Not finished there, the murderer then sliced off the flesh from her thighs all the way to the bone, which can be seen in one of the few surviving crime scene photographs. Since the Ripper was not disturbed, he indulged in every grotesque mutilation fantasy he ever dreamed. He totally eviscerated Kelly's corpse, leaving even the most seasoned police investigators nauseated at the sight of the crime scene. On November 10, 1888, sensing he would be no closer to catching the killer than when he first started the investigation, Sir Charles Warren, Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, resigned. Throughout the investigation, authorities resisted offering rewards for information leading to the capture and prosecution of the murderer. But after the discovery of Mary Jane Kelly and the clamor from the East End of London to catch this monster, Queen Victoria signed a royal pardon for anyone, accomplice or witness, who would come forward with information leading to the capture and prosecution of the man or men responsible for the Whitechapel murders. No one came forward to claim the pardon. Scotland Yard closed the case and deemed the file not to be opened until 1993. Jack the Ripper is the most famous serial killer in the world, bar none. Theories have abounded as to the identity of this killer, but one theory drew great interest in the mid-1980s when author Stephen Knight came forward with his book, Jack the Ripper, The Final Solution, claiming to have solved the mystery. According to Stephen Knight, the final victim, Mary Ann Kelly, ties the whole story of his royal conspiracy together. Knight stated that he met a man named Joseph Gorman Sickert, the alleged bastard son of the 19th century painter Walter Sickert, in the mid-1970s. Knight left no reason at the time to doubt the incredible story that Sickert related to him and the repercussions of Sickert's assertions. Knight's story began 4 years prior to the Whitechapel murders. The Queen's grandson, Prince Albert Victor Christian Edward, the Duke of Clarence and Avondale, known as Eddie to his intimates, felt as though the world passed him by. The young prince never ventured far away from the court, and the atmosphere grew in stuffiness which appeared to asphyxiate Eddie. Therefore, Queen Victoria made a decision to allow her grandson to mingle amongst the people in order to learn about the citizenry he would one day rule. The Queen engaged a court painter, Walter Sickert, to take her grandson into the more common areas of London in order to acclimate the young 24-year-old Eddie to his subjects. Sickert always thought to ingratiate himself to the rich and famous, and did exactly as he was instructed. Sickert introduced Eddie as his younger brother and the two became quite the partygoers in the late 19th century. Sickert brought his brother to the various drinking establishments and shops in the East End area. At one of these locations, a confectioner's store, Eddie allegedly met a young lady named Annie Elizabeth Crook. During the course of his secret visits to Whitechapel, Eddie grew fonder of her, and she for him. Over time, the two fell in love and were married, allegedly. Herein begins the difficulty. Eddie was Anglican, Annie was Catholic. This alone would have been enough to bring down the throne. However, Knight's story gets even better. Eventually, after this alleged marriage, Eddie and Annie had a child, Alice Margaret Crook. To confirm this, there is a birth record for Alice Margaret Crook, but it does not list the name of the father. The mere whisper of an illegitimate royal baby would have seriously caused a rift in English society. The heir to the throne of the largest empire on the planet married a Catholic and then produced a child? Once word got back to the court regarding Eddie's liaison, he appeared before Queen Victoria and received a severe reprimand. At the same time, the Queen's closest advisors stated that the Crown may experience a larger problem. Annie Crook had friends in the East End, primarily prostitutes. Therefore, Queen Elizabeth's trusted advisor and Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, discovered the news of Eddie's trysts and approached the Queen with the information. The Queen entrusted the wily Salisbury to handle the situation. Government officials received word that 5 Whitechapel prostitutes knew of the prince's indiscretion and threatened to expose the whole unfortunate series of events. For a price, that is. Lord Salisbury now had an extremely delicate problem on his hands. Annie Crook and 5 prostitutes knew of the affair and the child. If he put all 5 of them in an insane asylum with them telling the same story, someone would begin to believe them. But if he could eliminate them, making it appear as though a crazed killer were on the loose, then perhaps, just perhaps, after the first or second murder, the rest would understand the predicament with which they placed themselves and would keep their mouths shut. At least, that's what Salisbury thought. After searching and then locating Annie Crook, governmental agents arranged for her commitment to an insane asylum. It was rumored that all she kept exclaiming was the name of her lover, Eddie. But what about the other 5 prostitutes who longed for the payday associated with their knowledge? According to Knight, Salisbury turned to the organization that held membership for most of the upper-class gentlemen in British society, the Freemasons. Within this group, members took an oath in order to never betray a fellow member, no matter what their transgression may have been. One of his lodge brothers, William Withy Gull, stood as a 33rd degree Mason, but was also a doctor. Not just any doctor, but physician in ordinary to Queen Victoria and the royal family. After enlisting Dr. Gull with this demonic mission, someone had to be engaged to travel around Whitechapel in order to find these alleged extortionists. A carriage driver named John Netley, a character of shady reputation who knew the area, allegedly drove Gull around to find the women. One of the most important aspects of Knight's story has to deal with the final victim, Mary Kelly. Kelly had worked at a high-class brothel in the West End before she came down on her luck and moved to Whitechapel, taking to the streets. Supposedly, Kelly babysat the Crook child and knew the story, telling the other prostitutes and thus sealing their fate. When the murders commenced, Lord Salisbury wanted to make sure that perhaps the killer would not be pursued due to the fact that he was a member of this assumed secret society, the Freemasons. Confirming this assertion may not be so difficult, as other authors and historians have forwarded. In one of the murders, that of Annie Chapman, the body appeared to have been ritually sacrificed. Her entrails had been removed from the body with their mesenteric attachments severed and placed over her shoulder. Knight contended that the murder of Chapman stood as a ritualistic warning more than anything else. In addition, on the night of the double event, the murder of Stride and Eddowes, a young police officer walked past the doorway on Goulston Street where he found the Jew's message. Jewess, in Masonic lore, represented the 3 men who murdered the Master Mason, Hiram of Biff. In punishing the deed of these 3 men, They were executed by having their organs thrown over their shoulders. Knight stated that Annie Chapman's murder followed Masonic ritual to notify other Masons that they were responsible, and also to keep investigators at bay. The author also maintained that the higher in the organization an officiant progresses, the more it becomes incumbent upon him never to betray a brother Mason, no matter what the offense committed. Knight also contended that his source, Joseph Sickert, presented the scenario as to why there was little blood at the crime scenes. Sickert stated that the women were attracted to the carriage with an offering of grapes. Grapes were not readily available to the lower classes and were considered a delicacy. This may be evidenced by the fact that a couple of the women had spent grape sprigs in their hands at the times of their deaths. In order to answer the lack of blood at the crime scene, Sickert explained that the grapes that the women so readily ate had been laced with laudanum, a tincture of opium, and they were unconscious when the mutilations began in the carriage. John Netley, the driver, would have been responsible for driving the bodies to the crime scenes, but Dr. Gull may have had a part in ritually placing the dead women. Knight pressed Sickert for information as to how the conspirators identified the women to be killed. Sickert stated that Jack the Ripper was not 2 men, but 3, the third man being none other than his own alleged father, Walter Sickert. He led Prince Eddie to the East End and could identify the women, as they may either have posed for his drawings or frequented the establishments of Sickert and Prince Eddie. Additionally, as an artist, Walter Sickert allegedly drew clues of the Whitechapel murders into some of his later paintings, and would visit Whitechapel dressed as the Ripper in his later years. In concluding his accusations, according to Joseph Sickert, Knight stated that of all the letters allegedly written by Jack the Ripper, the only one that he believed the killer authored was the letter written to George Lusk of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. All others seemed to be playful hoaxes, and Knight stressed that due to the amount of the letters, Jack the Ripper would have had no time to commit any murders if all he did was write letters to the local press and the authorities. Annie Elizabeth Crook died in an insane asylum, and by the time of the death of Mary Kelly took place, the murderer or murderers had practically completed their task. The difference between the murders of the other women and Kelly is that she was the ultimate target of the conspiracy, and the Masons wanted to make sure her death stood as an everlasting warning to those who would try to topple the crown. Unfortunately for Knight, later investigations demonstrated that the canonical 5 may not have been the only victims of the elusive Whitechapel murderer, with the killings ending in 1891. Knight weaved a believable tale, but would it survive the test of over 130 years and the scrutiny of criminologists and historians over the years? On the side of State Route 70, on the way to Quincy in Northern California, a dilapidated wooden structure once stood that captured a brutal and tragic moment in time, an abode that reminded local residents of a most horrendous event. Glenna Susan Sue Sharp, seeking a change from an abusive marriage and also a safer environment for her children, separated from her husband Gary in July 1979. Since Gary was in the U.S. Navy and moved around a great deal, Sue wanted to provide stability for her children and end the treatment she received from her husband. She eventually moved, along with her 15-year-old son John, 14-year-old daughter Sheila, 12-year-old daughter Tina, and 2 younger sons Rick, aged 10, and 5-year-old son Greg to Northern California from her Connecticut home, subsequently settling in cabin number 28 at the Keddy Cabins in Keddy, California. On April 11, 1981, all of Sue's children had plans with their friends. John was with his friend Dana in Quincy for part of the day, planning to go to a party that evening. His siblings were split between neighboring cabins during the day. Sheila and Tina were at Cabin 27, owned by the Seabolt family, while Rick and Greg were spending the afternoon playing with Justin in Cabin 26, owned by the Smart family. As nightfall approached, Rick and Greg came back home with Justin at Sue's insistence. The oldest sibling, John, was spotted with Dana in nearby Quincy trying to get a ride home, while the youngest daughter, Tina, also came back home to spend the night around 10 p.m. At approximately 7 a.m. on the morning of April 12, 1981, Sheila came home from her sleepover at the nearby cabin and let herself in as usual. She did not notice anything unusual at first, but when she entered the cabin, the sight that she witnessed was gory indeed. Within the gloomy cabin, Sheila stumbled across the blood-covered bodies of Sue, John, and Dana in the living room, all of them bound with cords and electrical tape. Sheila desperately searched for her other siblings to find them alive in an adjacent room, along with the friend Justin, but she could not find Tina. The police were immediately notified and showed up to start going through the scene. Sue, John, and Dana had been savagely stabbed with 2 different knives and beaten profusely with a hammer, the bloody weapons left behind at the scene. Further inspection of the bodies would then turn up an array of strange clues. Michael East, a freelance true crime journalist, stated, "The body of Sue was found lying on her side next to the sofa and half naked from the waist up, and she had been gagged with a blue bandana and her own panties stuffed into her mouth and secured with electrical tape, as well as covered with a yellow blanket. She had been stabbed in the chest, her throat had been cut wide open, and there was a wound made by a blunt object thought to have been the butt of a BB gun on her head. 15-year-old John Sharp was found to have had his wrist and ankles bound with electrical cord and medical tape, and his throat was slit as well. Dana was found face down on a pillow and had multiple head injuries, stab wounds, and had also been manually strangled. He was bound just like the others, and his feet were tied up with a cord that connected to John's bindings. There was no sign of Tina, but ample blood was found on the sheets in her room. In addition to the bodies, the walls had also been stabbed for reasons unknown, and a shoe print was found outside. Nothing had been stolen, but Tina's jacket, shoes, and a toolbox were missing from the cabin, as was one of the 2 hammers used in the killings. The drapes had been closed, and the telephone taken off the hook as well. Dana, John's friend, laid between Sue and John. He was face down on a pillow borrowed from the sofa. Bound with the same utilities as his mother and his friend, Dana was the only one who showed signs of being manually strangled. Although the living room displayed the gore of a bloodbath, only one other room in the cabin contained any blood, and that was Tina's room. There were 3 murder weapons that were discovered, 2 of which were lying next to the bodies in the living room, a knife and a hammer. After further investigation, a steak knife from Sue's kitchen was also found to be used for the murders. The knife was said to be used so aggressively that it was bent backwards. Investigators strongly surmised that 2 knives indicated the presence of another hammer at the crime scene, however, it was not found. Because of the amount of blood and the relatively controlled resistance on the part of the victims, it appeared to investigators at the scene that more than one assailant may have been responsible for the murders. Some witnesses claimed to have heard screaming and viewed a strange van in the area, and even interviews with the surviving boys brought no new information. One of the boys, Justin, claimed to have dreamed about the murders. He told police that he had seen Sue arguing with 2 strange men in the house, one with a mustache and short hair, the other clean-shaven with long hair, and they were both wearing glasses. These men had then apparently taken Tina away. This was considered a good lead, and composite sketches were made of the men based on Justin's description and widely distributed, but these turned up no new leads. Oddly, Police had the sketches done by an amateur artist by the name of Harlan Embry, who had no formal training in forensic sketching. Considering the information and evidence up to that point, 6 suspects came to light. One of the possibilities was Marty Smart, their neighbor, as well as Rick and Greg's friend's stepfather. Although Rick and Greg slept through the murders, Justin was the only possible lead left. What complicated the reliance on young Justin's story is that dreaming about a crime is not the same as actually witnessing what happened, especially one so horrendous as that which occurred in cabin number 28. In desperation to follow the only lead, the investigating officer put the young boy under hypnosis to recount the dream. In his dream, Justin described 2 men present, stating one had a pocket knife that he used to stab Sue with, as well as a hammer, which was also found at the crime scene. He also saw Tina come out of the room because of the commotion, only to be carried away by one of the men who later returned without her. However, no one was sure if the men Justin saw were part of his imagination or if he actually witnessed their entering the cabin. With a case such as this, it became apparent that more technical means had to be employed in order to determine the perpetrators, as well as the whereabouts of young Tina. Local authorities invited the FBI to join the case. Further questioning of additional subsequent witnesses uncovered that they saw a brown Datsun parked at the cabin that evening, and others noted a green van. Additionally, witnesses reported that they saw John and Dana hitchhiking back to Keddy after their party, the time being at some point between 9 p.m. and 10 p.m. The assailants wore gloves, and it appeared the murders were seemingly well thought out as opposed to a momentary explosion of rage. In fact, were it not for the carnage, there was no evidence there had been intruders at all. Police rejected any theories of ritual murders and believed the killer or killers clung close to the scene. One of the Sharps' neighbors at Keddy Resort would become a focus of some interest in the case. His name became linked to the murders for nearly 40 years, that being Martin Smart, the stepfather of Justin Eason. Smart proved to be a very dangerous individual. Obsessed with the Bible and preaching about other people's loose morals, Smart was almost stereotypically hypocritical. In one incident in particular, following an argument with his father, he purchased bomb-making equipment to blow up his house. He tried to buy guns and was known to practice his skills utilizing a hatchet as a weapon. On several occasions, Smart attempted to murder his wife, Marilyn. Having recently lost his job as a cook, Martin was supporting his family by both selling and manufacturing hashish, being in control of a large-scale drugs house with his own runners. Having seemingly moved quickly in the drugs game, he likely felt he found his calling. Perhaps his quick aptitude was thanks to his friend, John Dillinger. According to Martin, he and Dillinger had first become friends when the 2 men were patients together at the Veterans Administration Hospital in Reno, Nevada. Smart had attended the hospital while claiming to suffer from PTSD from his time serving in Vietnam. As Smart worked as a military cook during the war, he saw no combat. More than likely, Smart applied for whatever benefits he could milk from the government. After meeting at the hospital, Smart and Dillinger became inseparable, with Dillinger even moving into cabin 26 at Keddy alongside Martin and his wife. Marilyn didn't object, fearful of what her husband's reaction might be if she rejected the unexpected houseguest. While the focus of the investigation might well be Martin, it was likely Dillinger who called the shots in their odd relationship. He had convictions for bank robbery and breaking and entering and home invasion. Dillinger possessed links to the mafia and the notorious Chicago outfit made famous by Al Capone. However, while that may sound impressive, others say he was little more than a 2-bit hoodlum. There is some debate over the nature of the relationship between the Smarts and Sue Sharp. Some say Sue was counseling Marilyn over her violent husband, attempting to convince her to flee as she had done. Others say that Martin Smart was, in fact, having an affair with Sue. Others still say both those facts are accurate. For her part, Sheila Sharp doesn't believe her mother would have been involved with a man like Smart, despite the fact that Martin had a reputation for playing away from home.
My mom's character has been subject to all manner of cruel suppositions, including accusations that she was a drug addict, a drug dealer, a prostitute, or at the very least an unfit mother. For the record, she was none of these things. She was a kind and loving mother who was doing her very best to raise 5 children alone. She was dutiful in her attention to each of us. And while we lived in relative poverty, we also lived in a home of love.
Interviewed following the murders, Martin Smart claimed that a claw hammer was missing from his cabin. Martin Smart's stepson, Justin Eason, gave conflicting accounts of his experience on the night of the murder, at first saying that he had dreamed of the events before later stating that he actually witnessed them. While undergoing hypnosis, Justin claimed that he heard sounds from the living room while watching television with Rick and Greg. Getting up to investigate, he allegedly saw 2 men with Sue, both wearing sunglasses. At first he described as having a mustache and short hair, and oppositely, the second being clean-shaven with long hair. During the confrontation, John and Dana arrived and a fight ensued. Tina walked in on the chaos and was bundled out of the back door by one of the men. Again, true crime journalist Michael East wrote, "Forensic hypnosis has been widely used by U.S. agencies since the Second World War. However, it has since been debunked by critics as a pseudoscience. Experts have said that there is no evidence that repressed memories actually exist, nor that memory can be improved over time. They also state that a witness can be easily led through suggestion, and reversely, hostile witnesses can direct the course of an investigation through easily perpetrated fraud while claiming to be under hypnosis." The sessions were conducted by the then County Sheriff Doug Thomas after he attended just 2 training sessions, and transcripts clearly show that Justin was led throughout the sessions. By April 29th, the FBI passed off the investigation to local authorities, stating that those involved were already doing an adequate job and their presence was unnecessary. That was until April 22nd, 1984. Strangely, exactly 3 years after she vanished from Keddy and over 100 miles away. A bottle collector by the name of Ronald Pedrini was walking in the woods near the hamlet of Feather Falls in the neighboring Butte County when he came across the part of a cranium, investigators later finding part of a mandible and eventually other bones. The remains belonged to Tina. She'd been dead since at least the previous autumn. Despite the find, the police continued in the same manner as it had since day one, with very little evidence springing off the pages of the case file. While many unsolved cases go cold simply because of a lack of evidence or the killers managing to cover their tracks, that was not the case with the Keddy cabin murders. And, in fact, arrests and prosecutions should undoubtedly have been made. While frustrated investigators faced a lack of resources, some believed that investigators were sabotaged by actors close to their own investigation. Marilyn Smart claimed that she found a blood-stained jacket belonging to Tina in the family basement and handed it to police, although no record of this discovery ever existed. The coat was found alongside a blanket, a pair of Levi's with a missing back pocket, and a used reel of surgical tape. Following the discovery of Tina Sharp's skull, police received an anonymous tip that the remains belonged to Tina before the pathologist had made a formal declaration. This call was recorded but never entered into evidence. It was found languishing at the bottom of a cardboard box at some point after 2013. In 2008, Marilyn Smart stated in a documentary on the case that her husband and John Boubede were responsible for the murders, Martin having hated John Sharp. Marilyn stated she left a local bar around 11 p.m., leaving her husband and his friend still drinking. Around 2 a.m., she awoke at her house to find both men burning an item in a stove. Reports agree that Martin Smart and John Boubede had arrived in Keddy's back door at 10 p.m. in the company of Marilyn, with separate reports suggesting they may have also been seen in the bar later wearing sunglasses and suits while being raucous. However, what many reports don't reveal is that Martin had asked Marilyn to invite Sue Sharp, with Bobadé having apparently taken the Shine tour. While it's likely that the romantic interest was actually on Martin's part, this would seem to contradict the claims that the killings were premeditated or that there was intense animosity between the four, despite Sue rejecting the invitation. Following the killings, Martin left both his wife and Keddy, traveling to Reno, Nevada. There he penned a letter to Marilyn which stated, "I've paid the price of your love, and now that I've bought it with 4 people's lives, you tell me we are through. Great. What else do you want?" Once again, the letter was never entered into evidence despite the police being aware of it. Sheriff Doug Thomas did not think Smart was a suspect, praising his cooperation and having provided endless clues that threw the suspicion away from him. Thomas pointed out the fact that the suspect had passed a polygraph test, and while this is true, in future conversations with a counselor, Smart said he beat it. The Keddy cabin murders remained a cold case until Plumas County elected a new sheriff, Greg Hagwood. Hagwood was a teenager at the time of the killings and knew the Sharp family personally, working on a painting crew at the county fair with John Sharp and Dana Wingate the previous summer. Hagwood re-interviewed some original witnesses, interviewed new ones, and recombed the case files. He even finally identified how John and Dana got home from the party they had attended, interviewing a woman who picked them up while hitchhiking. In 2016, Sheriff Hagwood discovered another murder weapon, another hammer, after authorities received an anonymous tip. This second hammer, which investigators had long known must have existed, was found in a local pond following a tip by a family member of John Bobadé. No matter how it was found, Hagwood acknowledged that it had been put there deliberately, stating that the location it was found, it would have been intentionally put there. It would not have been accidentally misplaced. Plumas County Special Investigator Mike Gamberg, who had been friends with Dana Wingate back in 1981, believes that Smart and Bobadé were undoubtedly responsible for the killings. The alleged killers who lived here, did they have any problems with law enforcement prior? Yeah, both of them had records. Here are things that were done. But I think most importantly, there are things that were not done that are hard to explain. Hagwood and Gamberg both believed that the initial investigation into the murders had been ripe with police corruption. Gamberg believed that police strongly suggested that suspects leave the area instead of arresting and pressing those suspects for more information pertaining to the murders. Martin Smart held some admission of guilt, but investigators seemed to ignore those admissions. In fact, after Smart moved to Reno, Nevada, he allegedly confessed to the murders to a Veterans Administration officer. This officer then passed this information on to the Department of Justice, who in turn rendered the information to the FBI. Authorities under the previous sheriff simply ignored the information. This begs the question, when do incompetent investigators become complicit in a cover-up? While it may seem that Martin Smart and John Bobadé are the likely killers at Keddy Cabin, it might not be so simple. In April of 2018, Mike Gamberg stated that DNA evidence from a piece of tape at the crime scene had been successfully linked to a living suspect. Martin Smart had died in 2000 and John Bobadé in 1988. The presence of DNA linked to a living individual. Hagwood and Gamberg believe that the long-believed version of events recanted by Justin are unsound, and the real motive behind the case may be a kidnapping of Tina Sharp. Greg Hagwood stated, "If you kill 3 people in a front room and extract the little girl from a bedroom, a motive has to be attributed to her. There's no end to speculations on why. John E. Douglas, world-famous criminal profiler and head of the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, shockingly believed that Tina may in fact have been involved with what transpired in the cabin. One of the first criminal profilers in the United States, Douglas thought that the killings were an afterthought and not premeditated, noting the domestic application of the weapons. Douglas stated, "Those determined to commit a crime had ready access to better tools. The crime was committed by a single individual, and Tina left intentionally. This person was likely involved in a relationship with the 12-year-old girl, having successfully groomed her. While the murders were never planned, once they happened, Tina was enlisted into assisting in the atrocity. The repositioning of the bodies and how Sue was covered and made decent. This care seemingly stands against the wanton and explosive violence." It was unknown whether Douglas was aware of Justin Eason claiming to be the one who had covered the body. Because of the conflicting and unreliable counts of Martin, Justin, and Marilyn, and almost everyone else associated with the case, it's not hard to feel a little of the frustration that might have faced investigators. Theories abounded. One of them surfaced implicating Bouvier. Another theory stated that the agent sent to Keddy from the DOJ worked within the organized crime section rather than the homicide section. One can understand the frustration and confusion inhibited by investigators at the time of the initial investigation. Either way, Hagwood and Gamberg believed that more than 2 people were involved in the killings and that a wider conspiracy was at work to cover up the crimes involving at least 6 people. Former Sheriff Doug Thomas, during the course of the investigation, had been linked to Martin Smart in a way that made believable any connections between the two. Sheriff Thomas then stated, "Martin Smart was not a friend of mine. At one point, he and his wife were having marital problems, and they came to my office when I was sheriff and wanted me to counsel them. First of all, I had just gone through a divorce at the time. I told them, 'Why would you want me to counsel you?' There was no shortage of suspects, but suddenly now everybody, 35 or so years later, have all figured out what happened and that all of the investigating officers were corrupt. It's laughable, is what it is." After the statement by Sheriff Thomas, former investigator Hagwood stated, emphatically, "It is my belief that there were more than 2 people who were involved in the totality of the crime, the disposal of the evidence, and the abduction of the little girl. We're convinced that there are a handful of people that fit those roles who are still alive. I have a measure of confidence that we've identified some of them, and we're going to be coming. It could be next year, but really the focus and our priority is getting the truth, getting the answers." If the evidence and confessions truly existed, the killings in Cabin 28 seemingly had no reason not to be officially solved, with the guilt falling at the feet of Martin Smart. With both Smart and Bouvier now long dead, the chances for justice for Sheila, Rick, Greg, Tina, and Dana's family may seem both remote and hollow. Questions remain, and the official solution that has been offered doesn't entirely satisfy. Yet Greg Hagwood and Mike Gamberg are determined to offer that small piece of comfort, to cleanse the wound that was dealt to the entire community of Keddy, California. Soon after the murders, people in the cabin community began to place their properties up for sale and move away. In fact, the owners of the resort tried to sell the entire property, but there were no takers. The property fell into a massive state of repair, and homeless people overwhelmed the area. There were several attempts to rebuild the property, but all of these efforts went for naught. Finally, in 2004, Cabin 28 had been demolished. Albert Anastasia was born Umberto Anastasio in Trompea, Calabria, Italy. His parents were Raffaello Anastasio and Luisa Nomina de Filippi, but the family went with his father's surname, Anastasio, until Albert decided to use Anastasia in 1921. He was also part of a large family, having 8 brothers and 3 sisters. Albert himself was married to Elsa Barnisi, whom he had a son by the name of Anthony Anastasia Jr. Just a year before Prohibition hit the shores of the U.S., Anastasia and 3 of his 8 brothers arrived in New York City, where they would illegally enter the United States to begin their life of work. After only being in the U.S. for more than 2 years, Anastasia was already drawing the attention of the law, and was in fact convicted of murdering longshoreman George Torino in March 1921 after the pair had an argument. Of course, back then, the penalty was death, and a long trip to Sing Sing State Prison, where he would sit on death row until his execution. Luckily for Albert, he somehow, possibly through legal complications, managed to swing a new trial for 1922, and coincidentally, the 4 main prosecution witnesses had disappeared in the time leading up to the newly scheduled trial. This resulted in Albert Anastasia walking free. His life as a free man didn't last too long, though, as in June 1923 he was convicted again, this time for illegal possession of a firearm in which he would be locked away for 2 years. By the late 1920s, he'd worked his way up the International Longshoremen's Association, which resulted in his control of 6 union local chapters in Brooklyn. It was during this time that Albert Anastasia would become connected with Joe the Boss Masseria, and of course associating himself with the likes of Joe Adonis, Vito Genovese, Frank Costello, and the most famous of all, the chairman of the mob, Charles Lucky Luciano. It was these powerful connections that helped Albert climb the ladder and virtually become untouchable. In 1928, he was charged with a murder in Brooklyn, but the witnesses either disappeared or refused to testify in court. In 1930, we saw the assassination of 2 old-time bosses who controlled the organized crime rackets in New York. First to be taken out was Joe the Boss Masseria in April of 1931, who was lured into a meeting at Coney Island, Brooklyn. Halfway through the meal that he and Lucky were having, Lucky excused himself from the table to visit the restroom. The plan was then forged so that Anastasia, Vito Genovese, Joe Adonis, and Bugsy Siegel would rush the dinner and take out Masseria. The plan worked perfectly, and Joe was left dead holding on to a playing card, the Ace of Spades. This would put an end to the Castellamarese War, and would retain peace on the streets to avoid prying law officials' eyes. It was during this phase that Maranzano would then reorganize the mafia into 5 families. Anastasia was appointed the underboss of Vincent Mangano's family, which today is known as the Gambino crime family. Not long after the departure of Joe Masseria was the murder of Salvatore Maranzano, who was a completely different character to Joe the Boss. Joe the Boss was a slob. Maranzano was respectable and well-dressed. In September 1931, Luciano's men entered the offices of Maranzano and disposed of his bodyguards, who weren't armed at the time due to a new policy that Maranzano had enforced so that they wouldn't be found packing any firearms if searched by the law. With the bodyguards out of the way, Luciano's men shot and stabbed Maranzano in his own office. It was decided that sometimes distasteful things must be done to keep the commission nice and profitable for the good of the National Crime Commission. This included killing people who endangered the continued flow of cash into the commission's coffers. The commission decided that they needed to establish a separate branch of the commission responsible for one thing and one thing only: the murder of those people the bosses said needed to be killed. Louis Lepke Burkhalter was put in charge of what the press called Murder Incorporated. To assist Lepke with his duties, the commission appointed Albert Anastasia, nicknamed the Lord High Executioner, to be Lepke's right-hand man. Lepke would never give a direct order to any of his killers to do a job. Instead, Lepke used trusted men like Mindy Weiss and Louis Capone to issue the final order and decree to the hitmen chosen. The first order of business for Lepke and Anastasia was to assemble a crack hit team to do the actual dirty work. Through Louis Capone, who was close to Anastasia, Lepke had been nurturing a group of homicidal maniacs, some of whom would rather kill than breathe the cool, fresh air of Brooklyn. These killers were called the Boys from Brownsville. The Boys from Brownsville were hardly the only killers employed by Murder Incorporated, but they were the foundation that led to as many as 100 freelance assassins being put on a steady weekly salary of $125 and up, to be ready to kill whenever an order was given. These men were sometimes paid extra for a job, especially well done. They were allowed to operate in designated territories in the gambling and loan sharking businesses, or any illegal operation, like hijackings and even kidnappings. But one thing was for sure: even if a member of Murder Incorporated didn't kill anyone for a month or 2 or 3, his killing salary came in steadily every week. Anastasia had become an important person to Lucky Luciano, and due to his loyalty, he was placed in co-control of the National Crime Syndicate's Enforcement Department, known to most as Murder Incorporated. He would share his role with Louis Lepke Burkhalter, who was a leading labor racketeer. Murder Incorporated operated for almost a decade, and in that time it is said that up to 1,000 murders were committed. That's 100 a year, and most were never solved. Anastasia was nicknamed the Mad Hatter and the Lord High Executioner during his leadership of Murder Incorporated, and hired killers to take out some of the orders as well as getting involved himself. Albert's business card that he carried around with him actually stated that he was a salesperson. With the 1941 arrest of Abe Relis on murder charges, law enforcement finally dismantled Murder Incorporated. Abe Relis was responsible for providing hitmen to Anastasia during the Murder Incorporated years, and it was Abe Relis who turned rat to escape the death penalty by turning in 7 members of Murder Incorporated. One of the men he was about to implicate was Anastasia. Bad move. Anastasia had power and contacts and decided to put up a $100,000 reward to take out Abe Relis. Abe Relis was then found dead. To many witnesses, he had fallen from a hotel window, but others say that his bodyguards cashed in on the reward and pushed him out the window. The same happened a year later then to another associate of Anastasia who was about to turn rat on him, and again the man in question, Anthony Romeo, was found beaten and shot to death not long after. Anastasia played a big part during World War II, and it was he who originated the plan to win a pardon for Luciano by helping the war effort. America needed allies in Sicily to advance the invasion of Italy, and the desire of the Navy to dedicate its resources to the war. Anastasia orchestrated a deal to obtain lighter treatment for Luciano while he was in prison, and after the war, a parole in exchange for the mafia protecting the waterfront and Luciano's assistance with his associates in Sicily. In 1942, Anastasia became a technical sergeant for the U.S. Army in a bid to move away from crime, as investigations were currently taking place that could incriminate him. The following year, in 1943, Anastasia received U.S. citizenship and was honorably discharged in 1944, where he would eventually set up home in Fort Lee, New Jersey. In 1951, Anastasia was summoned by the U.S. Senate to answer questions about organized crime, but he refused to comment on any of the questions that were put his way. You have to remember that Albert Anastasia, at this point, was only an underboss to Mangano, and Mangano became very jealous of his connections with the likes of Luciano and Costello, to the extent they would often end in heated arguments or physical brawls. In 1951, Vincent Mangano went missing, never to be found, and later in the same year the body of Philip Mangano was discovered in a wetland, shot 3 times. To this day, no one really knows who did it, but the finger does point to Anastasia in some form or another. The commission met up, and in the end, with the help of Frank Costello, Anastasia was made boss of the Mangano family, renaming it the Anastasia crime family. In March 1952, Anastasia was again reported to the order of a murder of Arnold Schuster, who was a young lad who had witnessed a bank robbery, could identify the thief, Willie Sutton. With the evidence that Arnold provided, Sutton was arrested, and allegedly Anastasia saw Arnold Schuster being interviewed on television. He said, "I can't stand squealers. Hit that guy." The order was carried through in the same month when Arnold was shot to death on a Brooklyn street, which resulted in a public accusation against Anastasia in 1953. Vito Genovese wanted to take control of the Luciano crime family, but in order to do so would need to kill Costello and Anastasia. To do this, Vito tried to turn Anastasia's supporters against him by labeling him as an unstable killer who threatened to bring pressure from the law to the Cosa Nostra. The plan seemed to work, as over the next couple of years he won the support of Anastasio's capo, the one and only Carlo Gambino, who he offered leadership of Anastasia's crime family in return for his alliance. Vito also gained Meyer Lansky, who was an influential part of the crime scene in those days and the manager of Lucky Luciano's business interests and affairs. Like many mobsters, greed got the better of Anastasia, which triggered Meyer Lansky in helping Vito Genovese. You see, Lansky in the 1950s controlled casinos across Cuba and offered the Cosa Nostra bosses lesser shares of his profits. However, when Anastasia demanded a larger share, Lansky refused. This led to Anastasia starting his own casino racket in the same area as Lansky, helping him to come to an easy decision to give Genovese his full support. After spending 1 year in federal prison in 1955 for tax evasion and getting hit with a $20,000 fine, Anastasia was also close to losing his citizenship and getting deported. Things took a turn for the worst in 1957 when Genovese moved on Costello. This saw Vincent the Chin Gigante make a hit on Costello. However, due to Gigante shouting towards Costello something along the lines of, "This is for you, Frank," the hit was a fail. Frank Costello turned around, at which point the bullet narrowly missed his head, causing a superficial wound. This was enough for Costello, who then stepped down as boss and handed the family over to Vito Genovese, who would rename the family after himself, which it still holds today. Later in 1957, Anastasia's underboss at the time, a man named Frank Scalise, was assassinated. According to Joseph Valachi, Anastasia approved the hit. Joseph Valachi testified in front of Congress in 1963 as to the inner workings of the mafia. 1957 was certainly a busy time of the year, and towards the end of it we would see the assassination of Albert Anastasia in what would be one of the most high-profile murders in mob history. The assassination would spark huge media and public interest. On the morning of October 25, 1957, Anastasia went to a local barbershop in Midtown Manhattan for a shave. Anastasia's bodyguard parked the car in an underground garage and then took a walk outside, leaving Anastasia with no muscle behind him. Completely defenseless and relaxing into the barber's chair, two men wearing scarves covered their faces, burst through the front door of the shop, shoved the barber out of the way, and fired at Anastasia at point-blank range. It is said that after the first rippling of bullets headed his way, Anastasia lunged at the masked men. Unfortunately for Albert, he had actually tried to attack the killer's reflections in a mirror. Eventually, he would drop down to the floor, dead. The two assassins kept firing into Anastasia's body, emptying their magazines. The murder sparked huge public awareness, and a high-profile police investigation would take place, although no one was convicted of the assassination. Of course, with a hit like this, there are plenty of conspiracy theories, one of which was that Joe Gallo was the hitman for the Profaci crime family. The Profaci theory is that Genovese gave the Anastasia murder contract to Joe Profaci. and then handed it down to Gallo, who was believed to say to an associate at the time, "You can just call the five of us the Barbershop Quintet." And thus, one of the most brutal murderers of Murder Incorporated, Albert Anastasia, died by the very principles of which he lived. After Anastasia's death, Gambino was expected to be proclaimed boss of Anastasia's family at the November 14, 1957 meeting at Appalachia. But that meeting had been raided by the police, and Gambino had to wait. Genovese enjoyed a short reign as family boss, and in 1957, after the disastrous Appalachian meeting, Luciano, Costello, and Gambino conspired to entrap Genovese with a narcotics conviction, bribing a drug dealer to testify he had personally worked with Genovese. On July 7, 1958, Genovese was indicted on narcotics trafficking charges. On April 17, 1959, he was sentenced to 15 years in state prison. Anastasia lived in a 25-room, 6,529 square foot hilltop mansion located in Fort Lee, New Jersey, from 1947 until his death. In 1958, less than a year after his death, comedian Buddy Hackett and his wife purchased the mansion, and after renovations, lived there through most of the 1960s. The mansion sold for $6.9 million in late December 2017. The house was last sold in December 2018 for $3.6 million and demolished in March 2019.
One of the most infamous gangsters of the early 1930s, John Herbert Dillinger was born June 22, 1903 in the Oak Hill section of Indianapolis, Indiana, the younger of two children born to John Wilson Dillinger and Mary Ellen Molly Lancaster. Dillinger's father was a grocer by trade and reportedly a harsh man. In an interview with reporters, Dillinger said he was firm in his discipline and believed in the adage, "Spare the rod and spoil the child." Dillinger's older sister, Audrey, was born March 6, 1889. Her mother died in 1907, just before his 4th birthday. Audrey married Emmett Fred Hancock that year, and they had 7 children together. She cared for her brother John for several years until their father remarried in 1912 to Elizabeth Lizzie Fields. Initially, Dillinger disliked his stepmother, but reportedly eventually became to love her. As a teenager, Dillinger was frequently in trouble with the law for fighting and petty theft. He was also noted for his bewildering personality and bullying of smaller children. He quit school to work in an Indianapolis machine shop. Although he worked hard at his job, he would stay out all night at parties. His father feared that the city was corrupting his son, prompting him to move the family to Mooresville, Indiana in about 1920. Dillinger's wild and rebellious behavior was resilient, despite his new rural life. He was arrested in 1922 for auto theft, and his relationship with his father deteriorated. His troubles led him to enlist in the United States Navy, where he was a fireman 3rd class, assigned aboard the battleship USS Utah. But he deserted a few months later when his ship was docked in Boston. He was eventually dishonorably discharged. Dillinger then returned to Mooresville, where he met Beryl Ethel Hovius. The two were married on April 12, 1924. Now, he attempted to settle down, but he had difficulty holding a job and preserving his marriage. The marriage ended in divorce on June 20, 1929. Dillinger was unable to find a job and began planning a robbery with his friend Ed Singleton. The two robbed a local grocery store, stealing $50. Leaving the scene, they were spotted by a minister who recognized the men and reported them to the police. The two men were arrested the next day. Now, Singleton pleaded not guilty, but after Dillinger's father, the local Mooresville church deacon, discussed the matter with Morgan County prosecutor Omar O'Hara, his father convinced Dillinger to confess to the crime and plead guilty without retaining a defense attorney. Dillinger was convicted of assault and battery with intent to rob and conspiracy to commit a felony. He expected a lenient sentence, but instead, he was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison for his crimes. His father told reporters he regretted his advice and was appalled by the sentence. He pleaded with the judge to shorten the sentence, but with no success. Dillinger had embraced the criminal lifestyle behind bars in the Indiana State Prison in Michigan City. Upon being admitted to the prison, he's quoted as saying, "I will be the meanest bastard you ever saw when I get out of here." His physical examination upon being admitted to the prison showed that he had gonorrhea. Now, the treatment for this condition is extremely painful. He became embittered against society because of his long prison sentence and befriended other criminals, such as seasoned bank robbers like Harry Pete Pierpont, Charles Mackley, Russell Clark, and Homer Van Meter, who taught Dillinger how to become a successful criminal. The men planned heists that they would commit soon after they were released. His father launched a campaign to have him released and was able to get 188 signatures on a petition. Dillinger was paroled on May 10, 1933, after serving only 9.5 years. Dillinger's stepmother became sick just before he was released from prison. She died before he was able to make it home. Released at the height of the Great Depression, Dillinger had little prospect of finding employment. He immediately returned to crime, and on June 21, 1933, he robbed his first bank, taking down $10,000 from the New Carlisle National Bank, which occupied the building which still stands at the southeast corner of Main Street and Jefferson in New Carlisle, Ohio. On August 14th, Dillinger robbed a bank in Bluffton, Ohio. Tracked by police from Dayton, Ohio, he was captured and later transferred to the Allen County Jail in Lima to be indicted in connection to the Bluffton robbery. After searching him before letting him into prison, the police discovered a document which appeared to be a prison escape plan. They demanded Dillinger tell them what the document meant, but he didn't tell them nothing. Dillinger had helped conceive a plan for the escape of Pierpont, Clark, and 6 others he had met while previously in prison, most of whom worked in the prison laundry. Dillinger had friends smuggle guns into their prison cells, with which they escaped 4 days after Dillinger's capture. The group known as the First Dillinger Gang comprised Pete Pierpont, Russell Clark, Charles Mackley, Ed Schuss, Harry Copeland, and John Red Hamilton, a member of the Herman Lamb Gang. Pierpont, Clark, and Mackley arrived in Lima on October 12th, where they impersonated Indiana state police officers, claiming they had come to extradite Dillinger to Indiana. When the sheriff, Jess Sarber, asked for their credentials, Pierpont shot him dead, then released Dillinger from his cell. The 4 men escaped back into Indiana, where they joined the rest of the gang. Sheriff Sarber was the gang's first police killing of an estimated 13 lawman deaths by the Dillinger gang members. Dillinger was finally caught by Matthew "Matt" Leach, the Indiana police state chief, and imprisoned within the Crown Point jail sometime after committing a robbery at a bank located in East Chicago on January 15, 1934. The police boasted to area newspapers that the jail was escape-proof and posted extra guards just to make sure. What happened on the day of Dillinger's escape on March 3rd is still open to debate. Deputy Ernest Blunk claimed that Dillinger had escaped using a real pistol, but FBI files make clear that Dillinger carved a fake pistol from a potato. Sam Cahoon, a trustee that Dillinger first took hostage in the jail, believed that Dillinger had carved the gun with a razor and some shelving in his cell. However, according to an unpublished interview with Dillinger's attorney, Louis Paquette, and his investigator, Art O'Leary O'Leary claimed to have sneaked the gun in himself. After escaping from Crown Point, Dillinger reunited with his girlfriend, Evelyn Billy Frechette, just hours after his escape at her half-sister Patsy's Chicago apartment, where she was also staying. Frechette and Dillinger met a few years earlier, and Dillinger became smitten. According to Billy's trial testimony, Dillinger stayed with her there for almost 2 weeks, but the two actually had traveled to the Twin Cities and moved into the Santa Monica Apartments, Unit 106, 3252 South Girard Avenue, Minneapolis on March 4th, moving out on March 19th. They met up with Hamilton, who had been recovering for the past month from his gunshot wounds in the East Chicago robbery, and mustered a new gang, and the two joined Babyface Nelson's gang, composed of Homer Van Meter, Tommy Carroll, and Eddie Green. 3 days after Dillinger's escape from Crown Point, the second Dillinger gang robbed a bank in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. A week later, they robbed First National Bank in Mason City, Iowa. Dillinger and Billy eventually moved into apartment 303 at the Lincoln Court Apartments, 9395 South Lexington Avenue in St. Paul, Minnesota on Tuesday, March 20th, using the aliases Mr. and Mrs. Carl T. Hellman. The 3-story apartment complex, still in operation, had 32 apartments, 10 units on each floor and 2 basement units. Daisy Coffey, the landlord-owner, would testify at Frechette's trial that she spent most evenings during the Hellman stay furnishing apartment 310, which enabled her to observe what was happening in apartment 303 directly across the courtyard. The building was placed under surveillance by 2 agents, Rufus Coulter and Rusty Knowles, that night, but they saw nothing unusual, mainly due to the blinds being drawn. The next morning at approximately 10:15, Knowles circled around the block looking for a new Hudson automobile, rumored to be Dillinger's new car, but he didn't see nothing. He parked first on Lincoln, the north side of the apartments, then on the west side of Lexington at the northwest corner of Lexington and Lincoln, and remained in his car while watching Coulter and St. Paul Police Detective Henry Cummings pull up, park, and enter the building. 10 minutes later, by Knowles' estimate, Van Meter parked a green Ford coupe on the north side of the apartment building. Meanwhile, Coulter and Cummings knocked on the door of apartment 303. Frechette answered, opening the door only 2 to 3 inches. She said she wasn't dressed and to come back later. Coulter said they'd wait. After waiting 2 to 3 minutes, Coulter went to the basement apartment of the caretakers, Louis and Margaret Meidlinger, and asked to use the phone to call the bureau. He quickly returned to Cummings, and the 2 men waited for Frechette to open the door. Van Meter then appeared in the hall and asked Coulter if his name was Johnson. Coulter said it was not, and as Van Meter passed on the landing of the 3rd floor, Coulter asked him for his name. Van Meter said, "I'm a soap salesman." Asked where his samples were, Van Meter said, "Out there in his car." Coulter asked if he had any credentials. Van Meter said no, and continued down the stairs. Coulter waited 10 to 20 seconds and followed Van Meter. As Coulter got to the lobby on the ground floor, Van Meter opened fire on him. Coulter hastily fled outside, chased by Van Meter. Eventually, Van Meter ran back into the front entrance. Recognizing Van Meter, Knowles pointed out the Ford to Coulter and told him to disable it. So Coulter shot out the left rear tire. While Coulter stayed with Van Meter's Ford, Knowles went to the corner drugstore and called first the local police, then the Bureau's St. Paul office, but couldn't get through because both lines were busy. Van Meter, meanwhile, escaped by hopping on a passing coal truck. Dillinger then stepped out and fired another burst at Cummings. Cummings shot back with a revolver but quickly ran out of ammunition. He hit Dillinger on the left calf with one of his 5 shots, though, and then hastily retreated down the stairs to the front entrance. Once Cummings retreated, Dillinger and Frechette hurried down the stairs, exited through the back door, and drove away in the Hudson. The couple drove to the apartment of Eddie Green at 3300 South Fremont in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Green called his associate Dr. Clayton E. May at his office in Minneapolis, 712 Masonic Temple. With Green, his wife Beth, and Frechette following in Green's car, Dr. May drove Dillinger to 1835 Park Avenue, Minneapolis, to the apartment of Augusta Salt, who had been providing nursing services and a bed for May's illicit patients for several years, patients he could not risk seeing at his regular office. May treated Dillinger's wound with antiseptics. Eddie Green visited Dillinger on Monday, April 2nd, just hours before Green would be mortally wounded by the FBI in St. Paul. Dillinger convalesced at Dr. May's for 5 days until Wednesday, April 4th. Dr. May was promised $500 for his services, but he didn't get nothing. After leaving Minneapolis, Dillinger and Billy traveled to Mooresville to visit Dillinger's father. Friday, April 6th was spent contacting family members, particularly his half-brother, Hubert Dillinger. On April 6th, Hubert and Dillinger left Mooresville at about 8 p.m. and proceeded to Leipzig, Ohio, about 210 miles away, to see Joseph and Lena Pierpont, Harry's parents. But the Pierponts were not home, so the two headed back to Mooresville around midnight. On April 7th at approximately 3:30 in the morning, they rammed a car driven by Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Manning near Noblesville, Indiana, after Hubert fell asleep behind the wheel. They crashed through a farm fence and about 200 feet into the woods. Now, both men made it back to the Mooresville farm, but swarms of police showed up at the accident scene within hours. Found in the car, they had maps, a machine gun magazine, a length of rope, and a bullwhip. According to Hubert, his brother planned to pay a visit with his bullwhip to his former one-armed shyster lawyer at Crown Point, Joseph Ryan, who'd run off with his retainer after being replaced by Louis Paquette. At about 10:30 in the morning on April 7th, Billy, Hubert, and Hubert's wife purchased a black four-door Ford V8, registering it in the name of Mrs. Fred Penfield. It's Billy Frechette. At 2:30 p.m., Billy and Hubert picked up the V8 and returned to Mooresville. On Sunday, April 8th, the Dillingers enjoyed a family picnic while the FBI had the farm under surveillance nearby. Later in the afternoon, suspecting they were being watched, the agents J.L. Garrity and T.J. Donegan were cruising in the vicinity of their car. So the group left in separate cars. Billy drove the new Ford V8 with two of Dillinger's nieces, Mary Hancock in the front seat and Alberta Hancock in the back. Dillinger was on the floor of the car. He was later seen but not recognized by Donegan and Garrity. Eventually, Norman, driving the V8, proceeded with Dillinger and Billy to Chicago, where they separated from Norman. The following afternoon, Monday, April 9th, Dillinger had an appointment at a tavern at 416 North State Street. Now, sensing trouble, Billy went in first. She was promptly arrested by agents, but refused to reveal Dillinger's whereabouts. Now, Dillinger was waiting in the car outside the tavern, and he drove off unnoticed. The two would never see each other again. Dillinger reportedly became despondent after Billy was arrested. The other gang members tried to talk him out of rescuing her, but Van Meenen knew where they could find some bulletproof vests. That Friday morning, late at night, Dillinger and Van Meenen took Warsaw, Indiana police officer Judd Pittenger hostage. They marched him at gunpoint to the police station where they stole several more guns and the bulletproof vests. After separating, Dillinger picked up Hamilton, who was recovering from the Mason City robbery. The two then traveled to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, where they visited Hamilton's sister, Anna Steve. In April of 1934, Dillinger and his gang were on the run from the law once again after a couple of close calls in Chicago and Point South. Looking to lie low, the gang consisting of Homer Van Meter, John Hamilton, Pat Charrington, Tommy Carroll, and the wild card, Lester Joseph Gillis, a.k.a. Babyface Nelson, decided to hole up north at the Little Bohemia Lodge in Manitowish Waters, Wisconsin. At the time, the woods of Wisconsin were a virtual playground for on-the-lam gangsters looking to beat the heat in Chicago, and there are numerous stories of lodges up in Wisconsin catering to the criminally inclined, with mixed results. Built and owned by Emil Wanatka, the hideout was arranged through noted syndicate attorney Louis Paquette, for a handsome fee, of course, paid by Dillinger. While the whole party enjoyed the stay, unbeknownst to them, Wanatka's wife mailed a letter to Melvin Purvis and informed him and the authorities that the Dillinger gang was at the lodge. For their part, the Dillinger gang was not entirely relaxed in their safe house and remained fairly vigilant in the event law enforcement did find them. Realizing the main road into the lodge could easily be blocked off, they all agreed before the raid, with exception of Nelson, that the best escape would be to follow along the shore of the lake. Purvis would end up organizing the raid on the lodge, which in time would come to be known as the Battle of Little Bohemia. Once federal agents and local authorities opened fire, the whole area became a battle zone. Splinters of wood from the nearby trees and the lodge itself permeated the air. Dillinger made his escape through the back, although the gun battle continued to rage, covering Dillinger's escape. He followed the plan originally agreed to by the gang and ran down to the back of the lakeshore and turned right. Although Dillinger had already made his getaway, Purvis and the other agents believed the gangster to still be in the lodge. Turns out he commandeered a Ford coupe owned by a carpenter who stayed at a local residence close to the lodge. By July 1934, Dillinger had dropped completely out of sight, and the federal agents had no solid leads to follow. He had in fact drifted into Chicago, where he went under the alias of Jimmy Lawrence, a petty criminal from Wisconsin who bore a close resemblance to Dillinger. Working as a clerk, Dillinger found that in a large metropolis like Chicago, he was able to lead an anonymous existence for a while. What he did not realize was that the center of the federal agents' dragnet happened to be in Chicago. When the authorities found Dillinger's blood-spattered getaway car on a Chicago side street, they were positive that he was in the city. Dillinger had always been a fan of the Chicago Cubs, and instead of lying low like many criminals on the run, he attended Cubbies games at Wrigley Field during June and July. He's known to have been at Wrigley Field on Friday, June 8th, only to watch his beloved Cubs lose to Cincinnati 4-3. Also in attendance at the game were Dillinger's lawyer, Louis Piquette, and Captain John Steeds of the Dillinger Squad. According to Art O'Leary, as early as March 1934, Dillinger expressed an interest in plastic surgery and had asked O'Leary to check with Piquette on such matters. At the end of April, Piquette paid a visit to his old friend, Dr. Wilhelm Loza. Loza had practiced in Chicago for 27 years before being convicted under the Harrison Narcotic Act in 1931. He was sentenced to 3 years at Leavenworth, but was paroled early on December 7, 1932, with Paquette's help. He later testified that he performed facial surgery on himself and obliterated the fingerprint impressions on the tips of his fingers by an application of a caustic soda preparation. Piquette and Dillinger would have to pay $5,000 for the plastic surgery, $4,400 split between Piquette, Loza, and O'Leary, and $600 to Dr. Harold Cassidy, who would administer the anesthetic. The procedure would take place at the home of Paquette's longtime friend, 67-year-old James Probasco, at the end of May. On May 28th, Loza was picked up at his home at 7:30 p.m. by O'Leary and Cassidy. The three of them drove to Probasco's place. Dillinger chose to have a general anesthetic. Loza later testified,
I asked him what work he wanted done. He wanted 2 warts, moles removed on the right lower forehead between the eyes, and one at the left angle, outer angle of the left eye. He wanted a depression of the nose filled in, a scar, a large one to the left of the median line of the upper lip excised, wanted his dimples removed, and wanted the angle of the mouth drawn up. He didn't say anything about the fingers that day to me.
Now Cassidy administered an overdose of ether, which caused Dillinger to suffocate. He began to turn blue and stop breathing. Loza pulled Dillinger's tongue out of his mouth with a pair of forceps, and at the same time forcing both elbows into his ribs. Dillinger gasped for air and finally resumed breathing. The procedure continued, but with only a local anesthetic. Loza removed several moles on Dillinger's forehead, made an incision in his nose and an incision in his chin, and tied back both cheeks. Loza met with Paquette again on Saturday, June 2nd, with Paquette saying that more work was needed on Dillinger, and that Van Meter now wanted the same work done to him. Also, both now wanted work done on their fingertips. The price for the fingerprint job? $500 a hand, or $100 a finger. Loza used a mixture of nitric and hydrochloric acid, commonly known as aqua regia. Loza testified,
Cassidy and I worked on Dillinger and Van Meter simultaneously on June 3rd. While the work was being done, Dillinger and Van Meter changed off. The work that could be done while the patient was sitting up, that patient was in the sitting room. The work that had to be done while the man was lying down, that patient was on the couch in the bedroom. They were changed back and forth according to the work to be done. The hands were sterilized, made aseptic with antiseptics, thoroughly washed with soap and water, and used sterile gauze afterwards to keep them clean. Next, cutting instrument, knife, was used to expose the lower skin. In other words, take off the epidermis and expose the derma. Then alternately, the acid and the alkaloid was applied as was necessary to produce the desired results.
Agents arrested Loza at 1127 South Harvey, Oak Park, Illinois, on Tuesday, July 24th. O'Leary returned from a family fishing trip on July 24th, the day of Loza's arrest, and had read in the newspapers that the Department of Justice was looking for 2 doctors and another man in connection with some plastic work that was done on Dillinger. O'Leary left Chicago immediately, but returned 2 weeks later, learned that Loza and the others had been arrested, phoned Paquette, who assured him everything was all right, then left again. He returned from St. Louis on August 25th and was promptly taken into custody. On Friday, July 27th, Jimmy Probasco jumped, or accidentally fell to his death from the 19th floor of the Bankers Building in Chicago while in custody. On Thursday, August 23rd, Homer Van Meter was shot and killed in a dead-end alley in St. Paul by Tom Brown, former St. Paul Chief of Police and then current Chief Frank Cullen. It was around this time that Dillinger met the female that would later accompany him to his demise. Rita Polly Hamilton was a teenage runaway from Fargo, North Dakota. She met Anna Compiañas Kilowak, a.k.a. Anna Sage, in Gary, Indiana, and worked periodically as a prostitute in Anna's brothel until marrying Gary police officer Roy O'Keel in 1929. They later divorced in March of 1933. In the summer of 1934, the now 26-year-old Hamilton was a waitress in Chicago at the S&S Sandwich Shop located at 1209.5 Wilson Avenue. She had remained friends with Sage and was sharing living space with Sage and Sage's 24-year-old son Steve at 2858 Clark Street. Dillinger and Hamilton, a Billy Frechette look-alike, met in June 1934 at the Barrel of Fun nightclub, located at 4541 Wilson Avenue. Dillinger introduced himself as Jimmy Lawrence and said he was a clerk at the Board of Trade. Federal Investigations Chief J. Edgar Hoover created a special task force headquartered in Chicago to locate Dillinger. On July 21st, Anna Compiañas, a.k.a. Anna Sage, contacted the FBI. See, she was a Romanian immigrant being threatened with deportation for low moral character and offered agents information on Dillinger in exchange for their help in preventing her deportation. The FBI agreed to her terms, but they deported her nonetheless. Compiaños revealed that Dillinger was spending his time with another prostitute, Polly Hamilton, and that she and the couple would be going to see a movie together on the following day. She agreed to wear an orange dress so the police could easily identify her. She was unsure as to which of the 2 theaters they would be attending, the Biograph or the Marlboro. Sage stated that on Sunday afternoon, July 22nd, Dillinger asked her if she wanted to go to the show with them, he and Polly. She asked him what show he was going to see, and he said he would like to see the theater around the corner, meaning the Biograph Theater. She stated later she was unable to leave the house to inform Purvis and Martin about Dillinger's plan to attend the Biograph. But since they were going to have fried chicken for the evening meal, she told Polly she had nothing in which to fry that chicken and was going to the store to get some butter. While at the store, she called Purvis and informed him of Dillinger's plans to attend the Biograph that evening. She also grabbed some butter. She then returned to the house so Polly would not be suspicious that she went out to call anyone. A team of federal agents and officers from police forces from outside of Chicago was formed, along with a very small number of Chicago police officers. Among them was Sergeant Martin Zarkovich, the officer to whom Sage had acted as an informant. At the time, federal officials felt that the Chicago police had been compromised and therefore could not be trusted. Hoover and Purvis also wanted more of the credit. Not wanting to take the risk of another embarrassing escape of Dillinger, the police were split into two groups. On Sunday, one team was sent to the Marlboro Theater on the city's west side, while another team surrounded the Biograph Theater at 2433 North Lincoln Avenue on the north side. Sage, Hamilton, and Dillinger were observed entering the Biograph at approximately 8:30 p.m., which ironically was showing the crime drama Manhattan Melodrama, starring Clark Gable, Myrna Loy, and William Powell. When Dillinger was in the theater, Samuel P. Cowley, the lead agent, contacted J. Edgar Hoover for instructions. He recommended they wait outside rather than risk a gun battle within the theater. He told the agents not to put themselves in harm's way and that any man could open fire on Dillinger at the first sign of resistance. During the stakeout, the Biograph's manager thought the agents were criminals setting up a robbery. He called the Chicago police, who dutifully responded, and had to be waved off by federal agents who told him that they were on a stakeout for an important target. When the film ended, Purvis stood by the front door and signaled Dillinger's exit to the other agents by lighting a cigar. Both he and the other agents reported that Dillinger turned his head and looked directly at the agent as he walked by, glanced across the street, then moved ahead of his female companions, reached into his pocket but failed to extract his gun, and ran into a nearby alley. Other accounts stated Dillinger ignored a command to surrender, whipped out his gun, then headed for the alley. Agents already had the alley closed off, but Dillinger was determined to shoot it out. 3 men pursued Dillinger into the alley and fired. Clarence Hurt shot twice, Charles Winstead 3 times, and Herman Hollis just once. Dillinger was hit from behind and fell face first to the ground. He was struck 4 times, with 2 bullets grazing him and one causing a superficial wound to the right side. The fatal bullet entered through the back of his neck, severed the spinal cord, passed into his brain, and exited just under the right eye, severing 2 sets of veins and arteries. An ambulance was summoned, though it was soon apparent that Dillinger had died from the gunshot wounds. He was officially pronounced dead at Alexian Brothers Hospital. According to investigators, Dillinger died without saying a word. Dillinger was shot and killed by special agents on July 22, 1934, at approximately 10:40 p.m., according to a New York Times report the next day. Dillinger's death came only 2 months after the deaths of fellow notorious criminals Bonnie and Clyde. 2 female bystanders, Teresa Paulus and Etta Natowski, were wounded. Dillinger bumped into Natowski just as the shooting started. Natowski was shot and was subsequently taken to Columbus Hospital. There were reports of people dipping their handkerchiefs and skirts into the pool of blood that had formed as Dillinger laid in the alley as keepsakes. Sickos. Winstead was later thought to have fired the fatal shot, and as a consequence, received a personal letter of commendation from J. Edgar Hoover himself. Dillinger's body was available for public display at the Cook County morgue. An estimated 15,000 people viewed the corpse over a day and a half. As many as 4 death masks were also made. On July 24th, the body was returned to Mooresville. It was put on exhibition at intervals during the evening to satisfy the curiosity of the crowd. The next day at 2 p.m., funeral services were held at the home of Audrey Hancock, Dillinger's sister, in Maywood. Dillinger's gravestone has been replaced several times because of vandalism, by people chipping off pieces as souvenirs.
On the afternoon of September 20th, 1911, a clear fall day in midwestern terms, the quiet in a small section of the city of Colorado Springs, Colorado, seemed almost deafening. Miss June Ruth arrived at her sister's house, Mrs. Alice May Burnham, to complete some sewing. At that point in time, people still left their doors unlocked, and Miss Ruth knew she would have no difficulty entering the house. But before opening the door, though, she noticed the pungent smell of decay permeating the porch of the house. When Miss Ruth walked into the house, the smell sickened her, and when she went to look for her sister, she opened the door to the main bedroom, and that's when she made the horrible discovery. There she noticed, as one newspaper reported, quote, "the mangled bodies of her sister, niece, and nephew, their heads crushed to a pulp, lying on the bed covered in blood-soaked sheets," end quote. Miss Ruth immediately ran into the street, raising the alarm. But these were not the only victims. Neighbors ran to the Burnham residence as soon as they heard the news and went to notify the Burnham's neighbors, the Waynes. When citizens entered the Wayne residence, the same smell of decaying flesh strongly penetrated the nostrils of those inquiring into the house. Mr. Henry F. Wayne and Miss Blanche Wayne and their 1-year-old child lay sprawled on the couple's bed, their skulls crushed to where facial bones had caved in to the point of unrecognizability. Investigators at the scene surmised that the killer made his entrance through the back door of each house in a methodical manner and murdered the families as they slept. In addition to destroying the skulls of his victims, authorities also determined that the perpetrator used the blade of the instrument to cut the shoulders and other parts of the body as well. One observer noted, quote, "Wayne's head was battered and cut to pieces. The skull of the infant baby was crushed like an eggshell," end quote. After completing the slaughter, the killer covered the bodies with bloody clothing, then left the axe, bloodied and covered with brain matter, near the outside of the back door. The axe belonged to a neighbor, J.R. Evans, and Mrs. Burnham borrowed the axe the week before. When Mrs. Evans went to retrieve the axe on Monday morning, she noticed the blood stains all over the blade, but she thought nothing of it, thinking that Mrs. Burnham used the axe to cut the heads off chickens. The murder of the Burnhams and the Waynes left the police stumped. As meticulously as they combed the crime scene, the killer left no clue as to his identity, except a bloody handprint left on some curtains. Police also noticed that the intruder turned over a bottle of ink and gripped the axe with ink-soaked hands. However, the handprints were smeared and illegible enough for a fingerprint analysis. Fingerprinting became the mainstay for identifying criminals after it was accepted as a legitimate crime-fighting tool in 1910. But any other evidence the police determined was useless. Police immediately thought of Arthur J. Burnham, Mrs. Burnham's husband, as the culprit, as he was the only occupant of the house who escaped injury due to his absence. Arthur J. Burnham worked at a local sanitarium as a cook and had not been home for the last 2 weeks. Police picked him up for questioning and noticed that the tops of his shoes contained spots of what appeared to be blood. Investigators stated that they would make an analysis to see if the stains were really blood or some other substance. Police later released him when his supervisor and security officers at the institution confirmed his alibi. Authorities still believed that Burnham had something to do with the murders, and they suspected that the cook believed his wife to be having an affair with an Italian in the area, and, in a homicidal rage, murdered everyone he could find within the close proximity to his house. Detectives questioning the husband intimated that a man named Donatell visited Mrs. Burnham frequently and that she would soon give birth. How soon was never determined. Mr. Burnham stated that before he and Alice were married, Donatell was her suitor, and after the wedding, he became a trusted friend of the family. Finally, Burnham became enraged with his interrogators and bellowed, quote, "You are barking up the wrong tree. Stop wasting time on me and get the fellow who did this," end quote. On September 23rd, authorities released Burnham from jail. As the investigation into the Burnham and Wayne murders progressed, over 900 miles to the west, on October 2, 1911, a small number of a church congregation at the First Presbyterian Church in Monmouth, Illinois, noticed that their custodian had not been to work in a few days and decided to pay the absentee worker a visit to discover whether he was sick. When the church members arrived at the custodian's residence, they knocked, but received no answer. When they went to the rear door, they found it unlocked, As the visitors went into the bedroom, they discovered the bodies of Mr. and Mrs. William Dawson, and in the adjoining room, the body of their 13-year-old daughter, Georgia. It appeared that each victim suffered from a single blow to the head, shattering their skulls. Each body was also wrapped neatly in a sheet, and the house appeared to be undisturbed. Authorities quickly ruled out robbery as a motive, as Dawson still had $40 in his pockets. When questioned, neighbors stated they heard no commotion whatsoever coming from the Dawsons' abode the night before. Since police ruled out robbery as a motive, they looked to the past of one of the victims in order to make sense of the slaughter. Investigators learned that Mr. Dawson had served time in prison for a lesser term due to his turning state's evidence against an accomplice, Chris Marzik. After serving his sentence in Joliet State Prison, Dawson reformed his life, met a woman, fell in love, and the two had a child. Dawson gave no indication that he reverted to his old ways, but when he left the prison, Marzik stated that he would get even, somehow. Police believed the accomplice to be the suspect they were looking for. Authorities resorted to summoning bloodhounds to the area to see if they would be able to catch the scent of the murderer. In addition to the canines, detectives from all over the area met in Monmouth to join the investigation. In order to aid the detectives and the bloodhounds, Governor of Illinois Samuel Deneen offered a $200 reward for information leading to the apprehension and capture of the person or persons responsible for the murder of the Dawson family, or information leading to the capture of, quote, the maniac, end quote, responsible for the deaths of the previous victims. Including the Dawsons, up to this point, the Midwestern Axeman had already claimed 14 lives. On October 19, 1911, 533 miles away from Monmouth, Illinois, in Ellsworth, Kansas, Mrs. O.W. Snooks telephoned her neighbor several times and received no answer. After finishing her housework later in the day, Mrs. Snooks went to the Showman house again and discovered the door unlocked and walked in and found William and Pauline Showman and their 2-year-old son, Fenton, dead with their heads beaten in with an axe. Their heads were so disfigured that unless someone knew the family, they would not be able to identify the three. Within the same room, in another bed, Snooks discovered the rest of the family: Lester, 6 years old, and a 4-year-old girl, Fern. Fenton was laying across the dead body of his father, with the head of one of the other children mangled more than the rest of the 5. Authorities believe the murders took place between 12 and 3 o'clock on the Monday morning of October 16th, although they were hesitant to pinpoint the time exactly. George Showman, Will's brother, came to the house on Monday morning at approximately 7 a.m. to bring some milk to the household. He noticed nothing unusual. J.D. Johnson, a co-worker of Showman at the garage where he worked, drove up in front of the house and honked the horn, but received no response. So he drove off rather than waiting. When police searched the Showman household, they noticed an axe sitting behind the door that appeared to have been recently washed. Small stains of blood appeared on the handle. When investigators held up the axe to the light, they noticed several small pieces of curly hair. The sheriff of Ellsworth notified Abilene, Kansas, and requested the use of the bloodhounds, and they arrived later that day of the 19th. When the canines arrived, the first one used took a scent from a piece of cloth that the murderer allegedly wiped his hands after committing the murders. The dog followed a trail as far as the junction where the Frisco and Pacific Railroad tracks merged, then abruptly stopped. The police then brought this dog back to the crime scene and gave the search to the second dog. This dog took the same route and halted at the same spot. Police believe that the assailant walked from the crime scene to the crossing and caught the southbound train between 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning. Police also believe that Chris Marzik may have been responsible for this attack as well. It would appear that Marzik was the brother-in-law of Mrs. Pauline Showman. At the time of Marzik's incarceration, he and Mrs. Showman's sister experienced difficulties and his wife divorced him, marrying another man. It is said that Marzik stated, as reported earlier, he vowed to get even with not only the Dawsons, but also threatened to get even with his ex-wife's family. An alarm rose when it was reported that Marzik was spotted in Ellsworth just 24 hours before the murders, with the police having been alerted that he was a suspect in the Dawson murders. What investigators failed to clarify was whether authorities suspected Marzik in the Burnham and Wayne murders as well. One of the witnesses who testified against Marzik at his trial for theft that sent him to the penitentiary, Marshall Merritt, stated that someone tried to break into his home and he strongly believed that Marzik the culprit. Investigators discovered that someone took a screen from a window at the Merritt residence, but then made no further effort to enter the residence. Harry Baker, the clerk at a local hotel, stated to police that a man matching the description of Marzik checked into the hotel under the name of, quote, John Smith, end quote, and stated that the man secured employment with a local mining operation. Baker also reported that he found a bloody shirt in the man's room after the murders had been committed and after the mysterious John Smith disappeared. As it turns out, a man named John Smith inquired about working at one of the mines, was offered work, but failed to return to start his employment. In order to expedite the apprehension and capture of the fiend responsible for the Showman murder, the County Commissioner Board offered $500, and Governor Walter R. Stubbs also offered another $500 to find the killer. A theory emerged regarding the Showman murders as the axe killings in Monmouth and Colorado Springs were somehow connected. This was the first time in the history of the investigation that authorities believed an actual, quote, serial killer, end quote, may have been at work. As the investigation into the Burnham, Wayne, and Dawson murders progressed, on June 6, 1912, in a small yellow house that stood at 710 West Wea Street in Paola, Iowa, two neighbors of the Rollin Hudson family, Mrs. Sherman Stump and Mrs. C.J. Music, noticed that the house seemed unusually quiet. The two women walked around the wraparound porch that adorned the quaint little abode, peering into windows to see if they could notice any movement within the residence. As they stood before the drawn curtains of the bedroom, the two women called out to the family through the window. A third woman, hearing the other two neighbors yelling into the house, walked into the yard and pushed open the unlocked front door. As quickly as she opened the door and walked in, she closed the door brusquely behind her, slowly walked into the front yard, and fainted. The original two women who first investigated the Hudson house hailed down a man, Herman Hintz, traveling in a buggy past the house and coerced him to go into the Hudson residence. Hintz walked in slowly after walking through the door, the three women still standing outside. Hintz walked out after a few minutes, and his face was ashen. He cried out to the women, quote, "My God, they've been murdered," end quote. Hintz then ran up the street. Within no time, the citizens of Paola heard about the murders and began to gather around the Hudson residence. When authorities arrived a short time later, they determined that the Hudsons had been killed with a coal pick that investigators believed the assailants stole from a local rail yard. Investigators also determined that the perpetrator crushed the skulls of the victims with the instrument that they discovered. Mr. Hudson's skull was crushed so intensely that he was not recognizable, quote, "the left side of the skull being torn away and a dozen other blows having rendered his head nothing but a bloody mass," end quote. Mrs. Hudson suffered from a blow to the left temple that tapered and caused death instantly. She also sustained gashes across the forehead, over the right eye, over the left eye that angled downward, that gouged out her eye. After the killer covered their bodies with a comforter, he then proceeded to bring down more strokes upon the dead couple's corpses. Investigators also deduced that the person that visited the Hudsons on Wednesday night before their bodies were discovered was well known to the family, as a meal had been prepared and photo albums opened and displayed. When police further investigated into the relations between the couple, one witness told them of a letter that Mrs. Hudson had received that she seemed, quote, breathless to open, end quote. When the couple went to visit the cemetery later that day, they quarreled viciously. A few hours afterwards, Mr. Hudson left a message for Mrs. Hudson that read, quote, "Well, I'm going to KC. Leave my clothes and those two pictures with Charlie. I will be back next fall and get them. You will not be bothered with me anymore. Goodbye. Rollin," end quote. The killer left no clue as to his identity, with the exception of something witnessed by one of the neighbors on the night that the murder allegedly took place. Mrs. Joseph Longmire stated a lamp hitting the floor of her small house awoke her from a dead sleep at approximately 12:05 a.m. and when she got out of bed, she spotted a dark figure running out of the back door of her house. Mrs. Longmire's 8-year-old daughter stated she witnessed a dark figure looking over the edge of her mother's bed at the time in question. Interestingly, a kimono belonging to Mrs. Hudson was found in the Longmires' dining room. The police took the evidence into custody. The Hudsons were last seen alive on the evening of Wednesday, June 5, 1912, by their neighbors, Mr. and Mrs. William Pryor, when both were seated on the couple's front porch. Mr. Pryor later told police that he witnessed a strange man in a dark suit walk onto the porch. Mr. Hudson then let the stranger into his home. Mrs. Pryor added that she did not notice whether the stranger left the Hudson house when she retired for the evening at approximately 10 p.m. In investigating the victims, police discovered that although the Hudsons had only been married for the previous 2 years, they experienced severe difficulties within their marriage, having been separated 3 times. When investigators uncovered this fact, they theorized that another man may have been involved with the murders of the Hudson family. With the series of crimes that took place over the last year, authorities formulated several theories as to the identity of the killer. The theory that seemed to gain the most traction was that the killer followed some sort of religious mission, punishing those he believed not worthy of living in God's world, or perhaps someone who did not deserve to live based upon their moral behavior. The reason police believed this to be the strongest suspect was that the murders held some similarities, and it appeared the signature of the killer matched substantially. Additionally, most of the victims attended church regularly. On the morning of Sunday, June 9, 1912, Ina and Lena Stillinger, the daughters of Joseph and Sarah Stillinger, left their home to attend church at the Villisca, Iowa Presbyterian Church. Later in the day, the church elders planned a children's program. After the morning service, the girls intended to have dinner with their grandmother, then attending the children's program at the church after services, then returning to their grandmother's to spend the night. However, one of their school friends, Catherine Moore, asked the girls if they would be able to spend the night. The girls received permission from their parents, and after the evening program, returned to the Moore household. Josiah B. Moore lived there with his wife and their 4 children: Herman, aged 11, Catherine, aged 9, Boyd, aged 7, and Paul, aged 5. The family returned from church at approximately 9:45 p.m. on the night of June 9th. On the following morning, Mrs. Mary Peckham, the neighbor of the Moores, awoke at approximately 4:30 on the morning of the 10th and went outside to complete her chore of hanging clothes on the line to dry between 5 and 6 a.m. Mrs. Peckham remembered that she saw the family leave for church the night before, but she went to sleep sometime around 8 p.m. and did not remember seeing them return home, and heard no noises coming from the house the night before. When Mrs. Peckham saw no sign of activity coming from the Moore residence, she walked over to their porch and attempted to wake the family. After this unsuccessful effort, Mrs. Peckham then went to the chicken coop and let the chickens out and checked on the other livestock. Mrs. Peckham then called the home of Ross Moore, Josiah's brother, to determine whether there were any problems with the family that would keep them from being in their home. Mrs. Peckham spoke with Jessie, Ross's wife, and Jessie stated that she would pass the information along to her husband. Later that morning, Mrs. Peckham witnessed Ed Selly, one of Mr. Moore's employees, visit the house to look after the livestock in the barn. After Selly completed that task, Ross Moore arrived with a key to get into the house. Mrs. Peckham stayed on the porch when Ross arrived at the house. At first, he tried looking in the window to see if he could notice any movement within the residence. Ross then entered the house and walked to the downstairs bedroom. To his horror, Ross opened the door to the bedroom and found 2 bodies covered with blood-stained sheets. Ross notified Mrs. Peckham to fetch the sheriff. When police and investigators arrived shortly thereafter, in the downstairs bedroom, they found the Stillinger sisters' heads crushed and horrendously mutilated. In the upstairs bedroom, investigators located Mr. and Mrs. Moore, their heads in a similar fashion as the Stillinger girls, with, quote, their heads crushed and almost severed from their necks, end quote. In an adjoining room, Catherine and Paul lay, their heads crushed as well. And still in another room, Herman and Lloyd, their craniums in the same condition as the other victims in the household. In the middle of the room containing the battered bodies of Herman and Floyd, authorities found an axe believed to be the only weapon used by the assailant who committed this unholy slaughter. From the appearance of the wounds on all of the bodies, it appeared that the perpetrator struck the victims as they slept with the sharp end of the axe first, then finishing his work with the blunt end of the instrument. Robbery was not the intended motive due to the undisturbed fashion in which he left the house. What perplexed investigators even further is that the killer must have had a key to the residence, as the door was locked from the outside. When asked as to whether Josiah J.B. Moore had any enemies, family members responded no. J.B. was a respected businessman in the community. Montgomery County, where the murders were committed, offered a reward of $500, and the state of Iowa offered an additional award of $300 for the apprehension and prosecution of the person or persons responsible for the Villisca murders. Again, bloodhounds from a neighboring county were brought in, but to no avail. They lost the trail of the scent at the Nottoway River. The Midwest remained quiet for a time, and then, on September 27, 1912, the Midwestern Axeman struck again. In Payson, Illinois, approximately 97 miles from Springfield, Illinois, and 16 miles outside of Quincy, Illinois, was located the farm of Charles Pfanschmidt. Authorities had been called out when Pfanschmidt didn't answer his door, and it appeared that a small fire had engulfed part of the farm. When police finally entered the scene, they found Charles Pfanschmidt, his wife, their 16-year-old daughter Blanche, and a lady later identified as Miss Emma Campen, a teacher and a friend of Miss Pfanschmidt, who had been visiting the family that evening, all dead. Unlike the other attacks, the perpetrator attempted to burn the house to conceal his crime. The Pfanschmidts received various wounds about the head, and their bodies were burned, but not bad enough in 2 of the cases to exclude an identification. Upon examining the crime scene, investigators learned that the Pfanschmidts retired to bed early. The telephone lines appeared to have been cut, and the relatives of Miss Campen were unable to establish a telephone connection with which to speak to her. When the local sheriff requested bloodhounds, as in the previous cases, something interesting occurred. The bloodhounds led the authorities to Ray Pfanschmidt, Charles's son. Ray worked at a camp just outside Payson, Illinois, and the dogs led right to him. However, authorities did not believe the evidence strong enough to warrant an arrest. Authorities reevaluated the murder scene and ascertained that the assailant attempted to dismember the bodies and burn them in the stove. This is what caused the fire, but it did not engulf the entire cabin. It would appear that another long hiatus may occur, and the killer's elusive behavior would keep him from detection. But while the investigations in the Wheat Belt continued, another crime near Columbia, Missouri, could provide a valuable link to all of the cases. On or about December 18, 1912, police responded to a call from the residence of Mrs. Georgia Moore and Mrs. Mary J. Wilson. Henry Lee Moore, Mrs. Moore's son, arrived at the home sometime around 3:45 p.m. after returning home to celebrate Christmas with his mother and grandmother. Moore tried the front door, but it was locked. He went around to the different windows to see if he could peer into them. After unsuccessfully attempting to enter, Moore went to the house of a neighbor of the 2 ladies named Mrs. Samuel Cornelson. When asked whether all the doors were locked, Mrs. Cornelson stated she had no idea why the house had been locked up so. Moore then went back to the house and tried the back door. He pushed it open, and when he finally walked into the house, he witnessed his mother lying on her back with a large cut from an axe across her forehead and her throat cut, quote, presumably with a knife, end quote. Moore dashed from the house without going any further inward and back to Mrs. Cornelson's residence and informed her that his mother had been murdered. The alarm sounded so that all the neighbors in the vicinity would contact the local authorities. When the police arrived, they found Mrs. Moore and then searched the premises for Mrs. Wilson. They found Mrs. Wilson lying on the bed in a pool of blood. On closer examination, Mrs. Wilson sustained a deep gash on the right side of her neck. The blow appeared to have cut off the lower part of her ear. This appeared to be the only blow she sustained. Her right hand was folded under her face, and her left hand was resting just beneath her chin. The angle of the cut demonstrated that the killer stood in front of the bed when he struck her. As far as Mrs. Moore, The position of the axe cut on her forehead indicated that, quote, this was made after she was on the floor, end quote. Police discounted robbery as the motive. After a coroner's inquest was held, authorities arrested Henry Lee Moore for the murders. After an in-depth investigation into the background of Henry Lee Moore, investigators discovered that Moore had been in prison for until as recently as May 1911, having been convicted of forgery. Prior to leaving prison, Moore wrote a letter to a 16-year-old girl named Queenie Nichols, where he professed his undying love for the teenager. Nichols rejected Moore outright, stating that he, quote, had no home of his own, end quote. Moore then told Nichols he would soon have his mother's house. He did not clarify how this would happen. During a subsequent interrogation, Moore stated that he finished college and received a degree from Kansas State Agricultural College 6 years prior to the murders, and traveled extensively through China and South America. When first questioned by the police, Moore gave conflicting statements as to why he appeared in Columbia, Missouri. In later discussions, Moore stated that once he arrived in Columbia, he registered at a local hotel under the name of, quote, L. Smith, end quote. He did this in an attempt to keep his mother from realizing he had come to town. Moore averred that he went to his room, then grabbed some dinner, returning to his room around 6 p.m. the night before the murder, and stayed there until the next morning. The whole time, Moore professed his innocence throughout the questioning. Moore had some small blood droplets on his shirt and explained that he had a nosebleed. Interestingly, Moore kept newspaper clippings of the case of Dr. Hawley Harvey Crippen, the London doctor who allegedly poisoned his wife to take up with his mistress. Police also discovered, through his self-admission, that Moore had the habit of visiting morgues wherever he visited for work out of, quote, curiosity. Moore engaged 2 attorneys to assist with his defense, F.C. Finley and Ralph Harris, and they met with their client the afternoon of his arrest. The prosecuting attorney, E.C. Anderson, stated that he possessed enough evidence to convict Moore at the time of his arrest. Anderson's challenge was to prove motive through documentation rather than just the wild rumors circulating throughout the region regarding Moore. After his trial, conviction, sentence, and affirmed appeal, Sheriff Bert Sapp of Columbia, Missouri, brought Moore to the state penitentiary to begin serving his sentence. In May 1913, an astounding theory surfaced that identified Moore as a, quote, serial killer, end quote, even though the term had not yet been coined. M.W. McClary, the warden's son and special agent with the Department of Justice, proclaimed that Henry Lee Moore was responsible for 25 axe murders committed across the midwestern United States throughout 1911 and 1912. Sometime after Moore's conviction, on a hunch, McClary sent Moore's fingerprints to J.H. Livingston, a fingerprint expert located in Jefferson City, Missouri. Livingston, quote, suggested, end quote, that Moore had something to do with the murders. The media at the time embellished these suspicions to the point that Moore was seriously being considered for the charges of murder in the previous cases, including the Moore family in Villisca, Iowa. McClary's theory was later discredited when the superintendent of the Kansas State Reformatory, M.F. Amrine, stated that he corresponded with Moore at the time of the murders, and Henry was in Columbia, Missouri at the time the series was committed. Back in Villisca, authorities tried the Reverend George Kelly as the only suspect who ever went on trial for the murders. After 2 trials, Kelly was acquitted, although Kelly had a penchant for writing obscene letters to women in an attempt to get them to type in front of him in the nude. Evidence suggested that Reverend Kelly had been in Villisca at the time of the murders, but scant circumstantial evidence failed to convict him. A dubious man stood on the gallows of Newgate Prison on November 15, 1892, prepared to meet the Almighty. Just his last wishes had been granted and the last meal ingested, the condemned stood on the trap doors waiting for the final drop. Just before he made his exit from the world, he stated rather emphatically, "I am Jack Thee." This one statement opened speculation for the next 130 years as to whether the executed man could have been the most researched and sought-after serial killer in human history. But after further investigation into the life of the condemned man, one Thomas Neal Cream, it revealed a psychotic personality who could have easily worked for good, but instead chose a criminal life that eventually resulted in his execution for murder. Thomas Neal Cream was born in Glasgow, Scotland on May 27, 1850. When Cream turned 4 years old, the family moved to Quebec City in Canada. Cream's childhood demonstrated no particular excitement. He did exhibit extraordinary intelligence and proved to be an excellent student. In his mid-20s, Cream attended McGill University in Montreal, where authorities suspected that he may have been responsible for a fire where he received $350 in insurance money. In 1876, Cream graduated with a medical degree from that college and desired to cross the Atlantic to study medicine in England. Moreover, Cream sought to escape a rather scandalous situation. It seems he impregnated a young woman, and the father of that woman held a wedding ceremony at gunpoint. After the honeymoon, Cream left in the middle of the night and made his way to England, leaving a note for his wife. Cream returned briefly to Canada for a short visit with his wife. Suddenly, she died of a mysterious illness. Feigning grief, Cream left Canada once again to return to Edinburgh, Scotland, where he began practicing medicine. In August of 1879, a woman that Cream had a previous liaison with was found by the police in an alleyway, dead, pregnant, and poisoned. Cream fled Scotland in a hurry and then fled to the United States. When Cream returned to the United States, he set up a medical practice in Chicago, Illinois. Always skating on the dark side of society, although Cream practiced medicine legitimately, he also performed abortions for prostitutes in the area. One woman he serviced died rather unexpectedly, and though Cream fell under suspicion, authorities failed to prosecute him for lack of evidence. On July 14, 1881, a Mr. Stott suddenly died from an overdose of strychnine. Authorities arrested Cream when it was discovered that Mrs. Julia Stott had purchased the poison from Dr. Cream. Mrs. Stott went to Cream's office for Mr. Stott's medicines as usual, and Dr. Cream insisted that Mrs. Stott go to another chemist across town and then return to his office where he would enhance the prescriptions. A few days later, Mr. Stott took the prescriptions, and within a half hour, he was dead. A few days after Stott's burial, the local medical examiner received a telegram requesting that an autopsy be performed on the deceased man. A few days later, another medical examiner received another telegram requesting the same procedure. A third telegram arrived at the medical examiner's office again. When the office contacted the writer, it was none other than Dr. Cream. Cream sent some of the leftover medicine to the medical examiner, who then tested it on a dog. The dog died, and the medical examiner exhumed Stott's corpse. The deceased man's corpse contained enough strychnine to kill 6 men. Cream tried to explain that the pharmacy was responsible for Stott's death, but soon the authorities arrested the doctor, charging him with the murder in complicity with Mrs. Stott. Mrs. Stott turned state's evidence against Cream, and now the suspected poisoner faced a murder charge. The jury found Cream guilty, and the court sentenced him to life imprisonment. It was not the end of the story, though. After serving 10 years at Joliet, Cream's brother pleaded leniency to the court, in addition to bribing some officials, and Cream walked out of the prison. After his release from prison, Cream set sail for Great Britain with a small inheritance that he gained from the death of his father. The wayward convicted murderer, now 41 years old, arrived in Liverpool on October 1, 1891. He went to London and settled down near Lambeth. While the rest of the country experienced wealth as the empire's colonies proved very profitable, the Lambeth area was very poor and poverty-stricken and seethed with petty crime and prostitution. Cream found that the opportunities for female companionship were plentiful, although by this time he was balding and now wore thick spectacles to correct his poor vision and crossed eyes. On October 13, 1891, Ellen Nellie Donworth, the daughter of a laborer and 19 years old, was unsatisfied with the labor she had been doing as a capper in Vauxhall Bottle Factory. She considered the work drudgery and turned instead to prostitution. She shared her room with Ernest Linnell, who did not seem to mind her chosen vocation. At about 6 o'clock on that evening, Donworth left her residence and informed her charwoman, Annie Clements, that she was off to have drinks with the man she met earlier that day. That man was Dr. Thomas Neal Cream. Later that evening, a friend of Donworth's, Constant Linfield, witnessed Donworth with a gentleman who appeared very well dressed and a topper in the period vernacular. The two seemed to have a good time walking arm in arm down the streets of Lambeth. A few hours later, another friend of Donworth's, James Stiles, spotted Donworth, supposedly drunk, standing near a gate where she could barely keep herself erect. Stiles went up to Donworth and noticed she needed help. He had her place her arm around his neck and the two made their way toward her lodging house. By the time the two made it to her flat, Donworth was convulsing and grabbing her chest and stomach, claiming she had excruciating pain. Donworth was said to have stated at one point, "That gentleman with whiskers and a top hat gave me a drink twice of a bottle with white stuff in it." Because of the severe pain, Donworth cried uncontrollably. While others stayed with the young girl, Stiles went to the local medical institute and fetched an intern named Johnson to rush to the lodging house to attend to Donworth. But by the time that Johnson arrived, Donworth's spasms became so unpredictable that all the people witnessing the fits could do was watch helplessly. Donworth continued to gasp for every breath, and the intern recognized that she had been poisoned and summoned the police. When they arrived, Donworth was taken to the local St. Thomas Hospital. The young, impressionable prostitute succumbed to her malady and died in the carriage on the way to the hospital. A post-mortem 2 days later revealed that Ellen Donworth had lethal doses of strychnine in her stomach. The coroner at the time, Dr. Thomas Herbert, confirmed that her last hours must have been spent in agonizing pain. The effects of the strychnine have been described as thus.
Although the convulsions are terrible, you do not lose consciousness. In fact, the mental faculties are largely unimpaired until death ensues. You know you are dying. The first symptoms are those of apprehension and terror, followed by muscle stiffness, twitching of the face, and finally, tetanic convulsions of the entire body. The body relaxes, and then the spasms strike again. You have a sense of being suffocated. Indeed, death is actually by anoxia, lack of oxygen due to contraction of the lungs. All the muscles go rigid, and the face and lips turn blue. Death occurs in 1 to 3 hours, the face fixed in a macabre grin.
Dr. Cream, as it turned out, prepared for each murder he conducted. He purchased his strychnine from Priest's Chemists located on Parliament Street. Because he was a registered doctor, he claimed to have attended a great deal of conferences at St. Thomas Hospital, a fabrication he related to many clerks at the chemists. He was able to procure the poisons he wanted as well as their quantities. By law, Dr. Cream had to register his purchases along with the quantities and then sign the register. He purchased in the first week of October Nux vomica in liquid form, containing 2 alkaloids, bromine, and strychnine. On October 10th, he ordered gelatin capsules which he determined to be too large. Donworth seemed to have succumbed to the fluid within those very gelatin capsules. Matilda Clover, 27 years old, brown-eyed and slightly buck-toothed, lived at 27 Lambeth Road with her 2-year-old son, landlords Mr. and Mrs. Voles, and a servant girl named Lucy Rose. Matilda found life especially trying since her husband and the boy's father left, forcing her to resort to prostitution to support her and her young son. In addition to paying her rent, the income earned from the streets allowed Matilda to maintain an alcohol addiction. Understanding that her life needed adjustments in order to take care of her son, she started down a path to recovery. Matilda had been seeing a Dr. Graham for her alcoholism, and he prescribed for her a sedative named bromide of potassium. During the day and night of October 20th, 1891, Lucy Rose, the servant girl from the lodging house, who stated that on that day, Clover left her room shortly after dark to meet a man named Fred. Rose learned this information after snooping around Clover's apartment while dusting, reading a note Clover left on a table. The note read, "Meet me outside the Canterbury at 7:30 if you can come clean and sober. Do you remember the night I brought you your boots? You were so drunk that you could not speak to me. Please bring this paper and envelope with you. Yours, Fred." Clover returned home at approximately 9 p.m. with a man. Because of the lack of light in the hallway leading to the residence, Rose failed to see the man's face clearly. Later, Clover left the residence to retrieve some ale. While she was gone, the man left. At approximately 3 a.m., the entire lodging house became alarmed when they heard Clover's screams. Rose and the Voles rushed to Clover's residence, and when they opened the door, they found her on the bed, naked and writhing in convulsions. Clover began to choke and vomited. When she was able to speak through the contortions in agony, Clover related to Rose and the Voles that Fred had given her some pills that she now knew were poison. The Voles summoned a doctor, but there was nothing he could do. Clover died at approximately 7 a.m. that morning. At first, Clover's death had not been classified as a murder. Her doctor, Dr. Graham, stated that she had succumbed by mixing an excessive amount of liquor, most likely brandy, with the sedative he prescribed, a response that would have, he claimed, produced the same bodily fits she suffered. If the doctor had been reading the local media, he would have realized the existence of the Lambeth mystery, mysterious poisonings that had occurred in the area within the last few months. Ironically, the authorities labeled Donworth's death as cold-blooded murder, even when she and Clover suffered from the same symptoms. Why the authorities did not follow up on the mysterious and elusive Fred puzzled those close to the events. Lucy Rose remembered that Clover informed her that Fred was going to give her some pills that would prevent venereal disease. Authorities took an additional 6 months before they even considered Clover to be a murder victim. As Clover's body was lowered into her grave at the Tooting Cemetery on October 22, 1891, neither Scotland Yard or the local constabularies believed they were dealing with an early serial killer. Letters sent by an M. Malone to two prominent members of society, a Dr. William Broadbent and a high-focus aristocrat, Lord Russell, demanded £2,500 for both in order to keep the information secret that they were responsible for Clover's death. This seemed strange since authorities did not consider Clover a murder victim at the time. In considering that Clover and Donworth were prostitutes, it was not uncommon for women to reduce themselves to that when times appeared really tough. Also consider that these murders took place not too long after the Jack the Ripper case. Many in the upper crust of Victorian society looked at these types of murders to be unfortunate, yet considered them to have a percentage impact on society. On the other hand, the common Londoner felt the sympathy of those who had to resort to this type of vocation to keep from starving. For the authorities, they considered prostitution to be somewhat of a black mark on their beats. In November 1891, a month after the death of Matilda Clover, Dr. Cream received a telegram from his family in Canada to come home so that the final disbursement of his father's estate could be perfected. Dr. Cream made friends and then cultivated somewhat of a relationship with a woman named Laura Sabatini, a woman he met on an excursion to Hertfordshire. Realizing he was no longer a young man, Dr. Cream desired a young, pretty wife that he could show off in society. To make sure that he had her heart, before he made the journey to Canada, Cream financed Sabatini's dream of owning a dress shop in the West End of London. Prior to financing his beloved's dream, Dr. Cream showed Laura and her mother around London, often buying them expensive lunches and dinners around the city. Kissing her goodbye on the Liverpool docks, Cream boarded the SS Cernia on January 7, 1892, headed for his homeland, with a plan to return to London very soon. Cream returned to London 4 months later, and in April 1892, he re-established contact with the Sabatini family at their home at Bermsted, Hertfordshire, where he proposed to Laura Sabatini, and she accepted. They dined at a fancy restaurant, and Dr. Cream projected the image of being an upstanding citizen. However, when he traveled to London, he became a night-prowling predator. One evening away from his fiancée, Dr. Cream stalked London in search of some female company. When he made his way through Piccadilly, he spotted an especially good-looking young lady, obviously a prostitute, that he invited back to his hotel for a romantic tryst. Before negotiating, Dr. Cream and the young lady dined at the Palace Hotel on Garrick Street, eating food and drinking a bottle of Burgundy wine. Dr. Cream learned that the young lady went by the name of Lou Harvey. In actuality, her real name was Louise Harris. The couple had sex, and Louise left in the morning, promising to see him again the following evening. When Harris met with Cream again, he offered her 2 capsules because he said that her cheeks lacked color and the pills would rejuvenate her. Being suspicious at the suggestion, Harris pretended to take the pills, and when Cream looked away, she spit them over the embankment where they stood for their rendezvous. Later that evening, Dr. Cream looked at his watch and told his escort that he had to get back to St. Thomas Hospital. He gave the girl 5 shillings and left her at a local pub. Perhaps since Harris got rid of the pills, Dr. Cream realized the desired effect he had hoped for would not occur, and should make his exit quickly, never to return in Harris's presence. Just at about the time these murders began, letters started to be received from around Lambeth that appeared to blackmail the addressee. One of the intended victims, Frederick Smith, was the son of a wealthy businessman. The letter threatened Smith that if he did not pay a certain sum, the sender of the letter would expose Smith as Donworth's killer. In order to avoid this exposure, Smith was to place a sign in the window of his business stating, "Mr. Fred Smith wishes to see Mr. Bain, the barrister, at once." Another letter was also sent to a popular member of Parliament accusing him of the Donworth murder and demanding £3,000, or the information would be brought to the proper authorities. Smith brought the letter to the authorities, who placed the correspondence in a file where blackmail letters had been sent to the residents of the area. As sudden as they began, the murders ceased. The explanation for this pause was that Cream visited his brother in Canada. In the following spring, Cream returned to England. On April 11, 1892, Cream followed Alice Marsh and Emma Shrivel, the 2 women having just met where they loitered in St. George's Circus just off Stamford Street. Cream eventually got the women to trust him, and they made their way to a rooming house located at 118 Stamford Street. Alice removed the key from her bag and opened the door to her flat. Once the trio walked in, they sat in the small living area characteristic of a small, poverty-ridden neighborhood of the time. Cream grinned at the women, and they attributed his jovial behavior to what was about to happen from a sexual standpoint. The women promised that they would drink with him and perhaps do more, but Cream made it a point for the women to consume the pills that he brought with them. This was the real reason for his gleeful look. The pills, he told them, would prevent venereal disease, the dreaded scourge of their profession. Marsh felt sorry for Cream. After all, he moved from Canada to practice medicine at St. Thomas Hospital and really didn't know anyone when he moved there. Or, that was the story that he told the 2 women. Alice Marsh removed her blouse, exposing an ample bosom, and silently encouraged Emma Shrivel to do the same. After the business had been concluded, Cream said he wanted to offer the girls a gift. "You will find them more precious than money," he said. Cream threw open his doctor's bag and brought out 2 little bottles. Cream took some of the pills out of the little bottles and handed them to the young women. He stated, "Take these before retiring. I will give you more next time we meet." When Alice asked if they worked, Cream responded, "Like nothing you've ever tried before." Cream left the lodging house at approximately 2 a.m., greeting a Bobby on the way out of the building into the street. At approximately 2:30 a.m., the landlady for the building, Mrs. Charlotte Voigt, awakened half-conscious due to a whimpering that she heard coming from the upstairs residence of Alice Marsh. The whimpering soon turned to loud groaning, then screaming, followed by a horrendous banging noise. Mrs. Voigt then awoke her husband and dressed in a robe before investigating further. When the Voigts opened the door, they discovered Alice Marsh on the hallway carpet, writhing in convulsions and pain, with an occasional spasmodic fit. Marsh struggled to breathe, grasping her throat in between the convulsions. From inside of Marsh's residence, Emma Shrivel also suffered from whatever malady Marsh had been experiencing at the time. Marsh lived long enough to inform the authorities that she and Shrivel had drinks with a tall, cross-eyed man who gave them each 3 long pills. After the police had been summoned, an ambulance from St. Thomas Hospital arrived, but it was too late. The young women died in the ambulance on the way to the infirmary. A later autopsy revealed that both women had high levels of strychnine in their systems. With the 2 most recent deaths, Scotland Yard believed a serial poisoner at work. On May 5, 1892, the deputy coroner responsible for the Marsh-Shrivel case, George Percival, received a strange letter from a man named William H. Murray. The handwritten piece subtly pointed to a Dr. Walter Harper of St. Thomas Hospital as being the poisoner of the 2 prostitutes on Stamford Street. At the same time, Dr. Harper also received a letter that implicated his son in the murders. The author stated that if Dr. Harper paid £156, that the author of the letter would suppress any of this evidence so that authorities would not arrest his son. Once the Harpers brought the letter to the police, along with the letter received by Dr. Percival, the authorities stated they would keep a good watch to determine where the letters originated and from whom. Scotland Yard wondered if William Murray may not be the same blackmailer under another pseudonym, an A. O'Brien detective, who had written the letter to Dr. Percival, which had accused a popular member of Parliament for the poisonings. It also appeared that 2 other people received letters regarding the death of Martha Clover. Because the tone and the handwriting appeared to be similar, the authorities believed that the same person wrote those letters. With the murder of Alice Marsh and Emma Shrivel, the Metropolitan Police, with the kind assistance of Scotland Yard, re-energized their hunt for the Lambeth poisoner. The authorities inquired into the local chemists to check their records for purchases of lethal compounds. They did this with a concentration on known criminals who may have used their real names to purchase the poisons. The authorities also searched the residences of known criminals to determine whether there was any connection with the poisonings. One man, William Slater, had been arrested in a Caledonia Road apartment. Slater had a violent reputation with the local authorities, and he also had what was described as a snarled face only a mother could love. The police found nux vomica and morphine. Unfortunately, even though authorities found these substances within Slater's hovel, they could not connect him to any of the poisonings. Scotland Yard strongly believed that because a gap existed between the time periods of the murders, perhaps concentrating just in London proper limited the scope of their investigation. At first, authorities believed that the culprit could have been a sailor who traveled to other destinations in addition to England. Cream probably would not have been a suspect had it not been for his own ego. At this time, criminologists and historians have hypothesized that Cream's downfall came from his own need to make mistakes so that he would inwardly be apprehended. ever since Cream made his way to England and kept returning. He made friends with a former American detective from New York named John Haynes, who lived near an Armstead's photographic studio located at 129 Westminster Bridge Road. The murders in Stamford Street had been the talk in certain corners because they only occurred a few days before. At that time, Cream, using the alias of Neil, sparked up a conversation with Haynes regarding the murders. Because Haynes still held the personality of a detective and because of his previous training, he took great interest with the poisonings. Haynes found his new friend's knowledge of the case to be extremely fascinating. Over dinner that evening, Neil and Haynes conversed about the murders, and Haynes expressed a great deal of surprise that Neil even remembered the names of the victims, as well as other details that were not covered within the local newspapers. After that dinner, Neil and Haynes decided to go for a walk in the Lambeth dusk. As they strolled past the rows of residences, they reached the address of 127 Lambeth. Once the two arrived at that address, Cream stopped and so did Haynes. Cream related the events of Clover's last night on Earth as if he were an eyewitness to the event. Clover, Cream claimed, was an imbecile that let a man she barely knew into her house. But then again, women of her dirt-cheap class do not live by brain power, do they? Cream continued that the killer managed to remove the foil wrapping from the gelatin pills, 3 of them, and put them in his vest pocket. When Clover returned after visiting a pub to bring back some drink, the killer presented her with the pills that he promised earlier. They should have sex, and then he will give her the pills. After their deed completed, they sat in the kitchen of the small abode to have a drink. The killer instructed her to just swallow the pills and not chew them because the taste would be bitter. He witnessed her take a large gulp of beer, followed with the pills. Placing his hat on his head, he stated he would be back later that evening to check on her. Of course, knowing full well what the pills could do, the killer left the young lady in her residence. When Haynes queried Cream regarding the knowledge he just imparted, the suspicious doctor merely stated that he surmised the events of that evening. Haynes retorted that he did not know detectives that worked that way. They resorted to facts and not assumptions. When Haynes asked Cream about Lou Harvey, Cream responded that her name must have been a shortened moniker for Louisa or Louise. Cream then led Haynes to Waterloo Bridge, just a short distance from where Harvey lived. Once the two men arrived at that location, Cream went into his recitation. Here they stood, right here, just having finished a sip of the grapes at the Northumberland. They were supposed to be on their way to the Oxford for a respite of vaudeville that began at 8:30, but he detained her here, admitting that he must leave her for a while, as rushing business called. He dropped into her small, gloved hand some money for the show, where he promised to meet her by curtain call and then with the 2 gelatins. "For your color," he told her. The stupid trollop believed him, and she swallowed them. Well, then, I imagine he scooted after that pretty scene and left her standing there at the threshold of hell. Haynes carefully watched Cream's eyes as he told the story. When Haynes asked Cream how long she could have lived after taking the pills, the doctor responded 2 to 4 hours. Haynes told Cream that he felt a little thirsty and asked where they could get a drink. Cream related that the Northumberland pub was around the corner and he knew the way. Haynes observed Cream's actions and how he moved through the dark streets of Lambeth, maneuvering through the fog like he was a native, or a killer who rehearsed his getaways with ruthless efficiency. The two had a drink and spoke no further about the murders the rest of that evening. The following morning, Haynes went to see his best friend in London, Inspector Patrick McIntyre, who was attempting to find Haynes a job with Scotland Yard. Haynes related to McIntyre that his companion, the previous evening, the man who called himself Neil, told the places, the times, and the methods the killer used for the poisonings. Haynes stated that he was probably using conjecture, but the American detective stated that he watched his companion through his eyes and his actions and swore that his companion was there when the murders took place. Just then, McIntyre rose from his desk and seemed to be deep in thought. The names rang a bell with the inspector, but he made a note on a notepad and informed Haynes that he would look into the matter. Haynes mentioned, as a footnote, that he believed the man he walked with through nighttime Lambeth was just bragging. But then the more details that Neal revealed, the more that Haynes believed his companion to be a viable suspect. McIntyre began thinking the same thing, that this man who walked along with all confidence with his American friend could most likely be the Lambeth poisoner. When Haynes turned to leave, McIntyre asked if he knew the man's address. Haynes responded, 118 Lambeth Road. McIntyre looked gleeful with the information as he remembered the letters of the intended blackmailer, and this was one of the addresses given for Dr. Harper's son, whom the blackmailer accused of the murders. McIntyre believed the man calling himself Neal was a very interesting suspect. Unbeknownst to Dr. Cream, the net began closing in on him. He still stalked prostitutes in the Lambeth area, and authorities in the London area were investigating him as well. The director of the Central Investigation Department of Scotland Yard, Sir Robert Anderson, wanted the case to come to a conclusion as soon as possible. When Scotland Yard pursued the investigation further, they discovered through passport records that the man who identified himself to Haynes as Neal was actually Dr. Thomas Neal Cream. Authorities also surveilled Cream around the clock, as well as combing records regarding the suspected death of someone named Lou Harvey. The Home Secretary issued an exhumation order for the body of Matilda Clover, and then Scotland Yard sent one of their top investigators, Frederick Jarvis, to North America to research Cream's personal background. On the night of Marsh and Shrivell's deaths, the police officer that bid Cream goodnight as he left the residence, an Officer Comley, was reassigned as a plainclothes officer and engaged in the surveillance of Cream. He reported to his commander that just a few days after his assignment that Cream spent several evenings outside of the Canterbury Music Hall, where the officer observed Cream watching women very intently coming and going from the venue. On the evening of May 12, 1892, Comley and another officer, Sergeant Alfred Ward, observed Cream purchasing the services of a prostitute near Elephant and Castle, St. George's Road, and the two officers followed Cream and the prostitute to her home on Elliott's Row. The couple stood outside of the residence for a short time until Cream left. Sergeant Ward sought out the chambermaid, Lucy Rose, that worked in the lodging house where Clover had resided. The reason the detective sought out the former chambermaid was that she actually saw the man that Clover identified as Fred, the man that Clover met the evening of her death. Rose described Cream as the man masquerading as Fred. Two other women went to the authorities, Eliza Masters and Lizzie May, who were acquainted with Dr. Neal back in October of 1891 at Ludgate Circus, where the stranger bought them drinks at King's Lud's Castle Pub. Dr. Neal chatted with the two women, and they considered him harmless. The two women considered the good doctor to be very congenial and gentlemanly, with an open wallet. Several days later, Dr. Neal stated that he would call on the girls again, but he didn't show. However, later on the afternoon he was supposed to be with the two girls, they witnessed Dr. Neal with none other than Matilda Clover. On May 6, 1892, authorities exhumed Matilda Clover's body. There were 14 coffins that had to be removed from a pauper's grave before the right body had been exhumed. After a lengthy autopsy, Matilda was found to have the residue appeared purple when color tested. A frog injected with the fluid found in the corpse's stomach, liver, brain, and chest died within a matter of minutes in the throes of the characteristic symptoms of strychnine poisoning, tetanic convulsions. The autopsy left no doubt that Clover had been poisoned. At the same time, Inspector Jarvis sent information from Canada, where Scotland Yard sent him to find some history on Dr. Cream. The information related that a man, Dr. Thomas Neal Cream, fell under suspicion when his wife died mysteriously after he sent some pills for an illness that she developed in his absence. And some American authorities believed that Cream may have been responsible for some of the deaths of prostitutes who died mysteriously in Chicago, Illinois. This preceded his release from prison through political maneuvering. The final nail in Cream's coffin was when the British authorities acquired samples of Cream's handwriting. When they received those samples, police immediately arrested Cream on June 13, 1892, for suspicion of blackmail. Police booked Cream at the Bow Street station, and he was charged with extortion before the magistrate. Cream kept his mouth shut and continued to proclaim his innocence. Superintendent Anderson wanted to keep Cream incarcerated until they could build a more favorable case. This the authorities did during the inquest into Matilda Clover's death. American Detective Haynes testified as to the details that Cream gave him on their nocturnal walk in a coroner's inquest. Haynes emphasized that Cream mentioned details from the murders that only the killer would have known. Additionally, there were witnesses that saw a man matching Cream's description with Matilda Clover the night she died. A chemist produced a bill of sale for strychnine, which Cream signed. Another witness stated that she spoke with Cream, and he related to her that he had evidence against a very popular member of Parliament who was responsible for the poisonings. Throughout the proceedings, Cream sat calm and cool. After all, he knew the law and believed the evidence presented against him so far could be explained away convincingly. But he did not count on the next witness to testify. The witness sauntered in and was very anxious to testify. That witness was Lou Harvey. She identified Cream as the man who tried to get her to take 2 pills that he suggested she ingest near the Charing Cross embankment. On July 13, 1892, the coroner's inquest found that Cream administered the poison that killed Matilda Clover. After being charged for her murder, authorities moved Cream to Newgate Prison. The trial took place from October 17 through the 21st, 1892. The prosecution produced the same material that brought the murder charge against Cream at the coroner's inquest. The defense produced no witnesses to exonerate the accused. In the eyes of the jury, Cream could not overcome the evidence against him and voted for conviction for the murder of Matilda Clover. Justice Henry Hawkins then pronounced the sentence of death. He told the witness in front of the court,
"Your willingness to murder was so diabolical in its character, fraught with so much cold-blooded cruelty, that it could only be expiated by your own death."
On November 16, 1892, since public hangings had been outlawed in Great Britain since 1868, Cream's execution took place within the walls of Newgate Prison. Present were the sheriff, a surgeon, and a justice of the peace. A Canadian newspaper resounded, "Probably no criminal was ever executed in London who had a less pitying mob awaiting his execution." After Cream reached the end of the rope, the mob outside acknowledged the black flag raised to signify to those waiting that the sentence of the court had been carried out. We hope you have enjoyed this Halloween special. Please join us for further episodes coming soon.